I think we're going to start.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing good. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to give Deb 30 seconds. I appreciate everybody's patience. Thank you. Welcome to the Board of Finance special meeting on the Metro Center project. If everyone can please rise, and we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. I'll take it myself this evening. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Before we start this evening, you'll notice that we've asked the selectmen to join us as ex officio members. I know Mr. Walsh will be joining us shortly. That's him right there. I also know that Mr. Stone and Mr. DeWitt send their regrets. They were unavoidably out of town for this week. On our agenda this evening is to discuss the current status of the Fairfield Metro Center project, establishing the requirements for necessary information to be delivered to the Board of Finance and other approving bodies prior to the consideration of an anticipated appropriation for the completion of financing for this project. Item number 2 is to discuss and act upon the retention of an independent auditor to conduct a review of the accounting and financing of the Fairfield Metro Center project since its inception. We'll discuss those items together. Before we get started, I'd like to review the state of play for this evening and how we're going to conduct this meeting, as it is a bit different than some other meetings we've held. First of all, I would like to extend my thanks and appreciation to my colleagues on the Board of Finance, the members of the Board of Selectmen, the members of the administration, as well as various RTM members who joined us tonight, in coming together in such short order, as we called this meeting formally yesterday, and I announced that I wanted to have this meeting on Monday night. Also, I want to extend a thank you to former First Selectman Ken Flato, who has agreed to join us as this meeting is in process. He is commuting from out of town these days, and he will be arriving late, but will join us and has indicated his willingness to respond to questions from our board. With that, it's been almost 43 hours ago that the town's government was somewhat rocked by the revelation of an approximately $2 to $6 million funding issue for the current Metro Center project. There was a long discussion at the RTM meeting. There have been numerous follow-up press reports, and there have been many public expressions of concern and outrage. All of this is justified, and important questions need to be asked and answered surrounding the state of the project. There's some transparency concerns, some project oversight and financial control potential issues. There's the next steps with the project, and there's any contractual obligations in the town's contract approval process through which the amendment had gone through in the past year. Now, I called this meeting to specifically address what I saw as a process concern: the information flow that will be required by town bodies in the coming weeks, as we may be asked to make decisions on how this project should proceed. Further, I was deeply troubled by comments made at Monday's meeting regarding it taking approximately 6 to 7 weeks to prepare a detailed presentation on the financial state of the project, something that should be readily available for a well-managed project from a financial perspective. These concerns were further justified by statements made by the former First Selectman, Mr. Flato, in press reports, indicating that he was surprised by this financial issue as well, which does indicate a lack of visibility into the day-to-day operations of the project from a financial perspective. With this in mind, I think it's extremely important that we level set this project and provide all the town bodies with an independent third-party review of the current financial state of the project, as well as a review of the internal controls, or lack thereof, and how the current administration can improve those controls and oversight of this project moving forward. Therefore, This meeting will focus on two issues. What information this board will want to receive in a future meeting to consider overfunding requests, or any funding requests, rather, or bond appropriations. Secondly, the consideration of an appropriation of funds from the town's contingency account for the appointment of an independent financial auditor to prepare a report addressing the flow of funds, the compliance with the bond resolutions, the current financial state of funds extended, a full accounting of the vendors paid from this project's funds, the internal reporting structure surrounding this project, the various internal controls, as well as any recommended controls and reporting improvements that this financial advisor or independent auditor can come up with. I would like for that report to be issued directly to this board through a subcommittee. And if the board approves this tonight, I would like to appoint Mr. Kevin Kiley, former chairman of the Board of Finance and our longest-serving member, to head up that subcommittee, assisted by Mr. Ken Brockfeld, as well as Mrs. Mary LeClaire, another long-standing board member, long-serving board member, to serve on this subcommittee, to receive this report from an independent outside auditor, review that with them, and then prepare the board for that presentation. I would also like the auditors available for meetings with the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, the RTM, and any RTM subcommittee, so that they can ask about how this project was conducted. Obviously, I need approval from this body to move forward on that, but I think we can all agree that we want as much information as possible before rendering decisions. In this spirit, I will limit public comment to these items, and we request that there be no further discourse on other issues, which, while they are very important to this project and need to be addressed, do not help us with the current goals of the information flow and the potential project management concerns. With that, I want to turn it over to my fellow board members and ask if there's any comments or questions or concerns as the process I laid out here this evening. Anyone? Mr. Walsh.
Chairman Flynn, thank you for this opportunity. I would just ask that in regards to that audit, or the auditors looking at the accounts, that a couple of things be spelled out. First of all, that legal services were paid out of that. Some of them supposedly to town attorney Dick Saxel, which during the budget season I was kind of surprised about, only because, you know, there's an account that we have in the budget for legal services. So I would like that specifically detailed, what amounts were paid out over maybe in a yearly basis, just so that we know how much was expended out of that. Secondly, there's been rumors floating around that maybe some funds may or may not, there were just allegations, could have been used for other projects. And if there was, I would like them spelt out. The auditors should know what the scope of this project was and what the money was supposed to be spent on. They should be fully versed on that. And if there's money that was, if there was, on any other projects or anything else, those should be caught and spelled out in that report.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Mr. Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Walsh, for your comments as well. Were we going to just at first decide if we were okay with the process before we delved into the laundry list of what we want to get, because that's one of our items on the agenda?
Yes, it is.
Was your question, are we okay with the level setting of the process for us?
Yes.
Before we go into that?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions, comments? All right, seeing none, board members, I'd like to open the floor to both the Board of Finance and the Board of Selectmen, and ask all of you for what your information requests may be for an upcoming meeting if we're asked to decide on an appropriation. Mr. Tetra, I'd ask you to feel free to engage in the conversation, given that these requests will be coming towards your administration, and we want to make sure that we're as clear as possible as to what those requests would be for the future meeting, because we only get one shot at this. So with that in mind, I know that Mr. DeWitt, who could not be here tonight, did send in a list of questions to Mr. Polito and myself, and if I can turn it over to you, Rob.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. DeWitt had 3 questions specifically. I'll just go through them one by one. The first one was, what have the contractors on the project actually accomplished, and what are their contractual obligations going forward? So I guess he's looking to see that what on the list of items to be completed has been done, and what's on, I guess you call it the punch list, that still remains to be done. That's the first one. The second question Mr. DeWitt has is, we had an estimate of $2 to $6 million in overruns. He wants to know, what is the estimate based upon? What facts, what data, what evidence is the estimate based upon? And then third, he asks, can town departments such as Department of Public Works offset some of the costs by doing some work out of their budgets or out of their time? So those are the 3 questions that Mr. DeWitt had.
Thank you, Mr. Polito. Other members had questions. Mr. Kiley, I know that you submitted some questions. Do you want to?
Yes,
have
thank you,
questions
Mr.
as well?
Chairman.
Okay.
First, before I go with a couple questions here, Deb, if I may ask you, can you, as preparation for the committee that Chairman Flynn intends to appoint to look at this, could you take a separate set of notes on just the list of requirements, or, you know, be able to segregate them for us so I don't have to attempt to scribble here and remember everything? Okay, thank you. I want to follow up on Mr. Walsh's comments, because he touched on one of the questions I had, which were the legal fees. And the presentation the other night, while it was good and while it was thorough, I didn't get a good understanding from that presentation where the legal fees were and what they totaled and how many legal fees we may still have out there. So that was clearly on my list as it was Mr. Walsh's. And in addition to that, and this might be a question that we can get answered on the spot here if Mr. Saxel's here, are there any escrow fees in association with this transaction that have not been allocated at a closing? I don't know if there were any fees that were being held in escrow for any of the closing items.
I'm not sure about I'm not sure about your term of escrow. In fact, there's about $800,000 that is being held by the Conservation Commission as a bond as part of what BlackRock Realty originally put up. So I think their original contribution since last April as part of the new agreement was approximately $5.2 million. About $800,000 and change is being held by Conservation. The project will have access to that money as the wetlands issues are completed.
Okay,
and that
so
should happen shortly.
Okay, so there's the conservation escrow. Are there any other escrow fees that are like more like legal closing type fees that have been held or that need to be held?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
There's $300,000 that the state originally looked at the $19.4 million grant, if you will. They immediately took $300,000 off the top and said they would pay themselves that in order to monitor the project. Right off the top, those are the two that
two
come to
big ones?
mind. Certainly, we can look to see if there are any others, but those are the two that come to mind right now.
Okay, thank you. Did you?
Can I just follow up on that, Mike, just so we don't have to come back to it? There was an escrow agreement, so the developer's money came into the escrow agreement, it says it was going into Attorney Saxel's account. Were all those funds, the $4.4 million been expended?
It's my understanding that if not all, almost all have.
Okay. And then the only other amount that pursuant to the escrow agreement from, that's dated April 28, 2010, was 2 conservation bonds totaling $843,564, and that's what you're telling is still in escrow?
Correct.
Okay. And then the state's money, the 19.1, we have to apply for that. They didn't send us that money, right? We apply for it and then get reimbursed on it?
Correct. For those of you that are used to school projects, the 19.4 that got reduced to 19.1 worked very much like we're used to on a reimbursement project. We actually got reimbursed at a rate of 80%. So that technically, if we'd finished the project on time, we wouldn't have gotten all 19.1. The only benefit I found of being over is that we got the full 19.1. We're in the process of applying for that. We have the typical reimbursement timeframe that you're used to, and that we haven't been reimbursed for quite everything yet. Part of the job of STV, that you do the construction inspection, is to certify for the state that the work was done. So that, in part, will answer Mr. DeWitt's question from before, that their job on site is to assure the state that this work was done, and then we're allowed to be reimbursed for it. Part of the delay is the appropriate paperwork that needs to be filed in order to get that money released from the state.
And just like the state on the school project side, you had, when in your presentation, had some flexibility in a number saying that we might not be eligible for a complete reimbursement for certain reasons, whether something's not eligible or something else like that. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Mr. Kiley, any other items?
Just a couple quick ones, and then I'll
Sure.
turn the floor over to other board members. Back to the vendors, Mr. Flynn touched on vendor payments, and I know Mr. Tetro's presentation on Monday night took us through April. So my first question is, how soon can we get the update through the month of May, and what information can we gather for the month of June, even if it's, not complete, since the month is not quite done? So that would be item number one. Mr. Hiller, could you address that?
We made a payment, one major payment to Guerrero Construction last week, early last week, in excess of $2.8 million. That was primarily for work done during the month of May. There were other payments to some engineering firms.
Mr. Hiller, when can we get numbers for the month of May, and then when can we get reporting for June, I think is the question.
That is.
Yeah.
I think, Mr. Barnhart, who has been the town's representative as far as this, is on vacation this week, as Mr. Tetro indicated Monday night. He will be back on Tuesday from vacation, and I think when we sit down with him, we'll be able to see what other invoices might be outstanding for the month of May, and be able to get a more updated schedule.
Do you have an internal timeline on when you're going to have May?
Yeah, it's my understanding that virtually all the numbers are in for May. As Mr. Hiller said, if Mark Barnhart were not on vacation this week, we would be pulling those numbers together and updating the charts that I did on Monday. This is about, and I would expect roughly the same timeline for the June numbers. All right, so about the third week in July, we'd probably be expecting to have the June results in, but we should have the May numbers shortly. As soon as Mark gets back and get those done, I would hope that would happen by the end of next week.
Okay. Mr. Kiley?
Just one more quick thing on Mr. Tetro's comment. As far as timeline goes, I mean, everyone has a laundry list of things that they want to get added to this list of requests, so I'll certainly yield the floor on that particular topic with the right to come back to it. But on timeline, I'm thinking, based on what I heard Monday night, it looks like obviously time is of the essence to some degree to get the project completed on time, and there's an August kind of, stated deadline to get some things either paid or get vendors taken care of so that we can keep the work going. Is there any way that we can move up the reporting? Because if we're not going to get June activity numbers in current month-to-date July numbers at the earliest until the end of July, I just don't know how that fits into a time frame of us being able to have the information that we need and the information requests completed to make an intelligent, informed decision.
We'll take a look at that, and certainly it's the intent to get the numbers to you as soon as possible. I think the question somewhere in there you need to address is what information do we get by having the July numbers that we don't have by having literally July through this July's numbers in hand right now. There will be 2 or 3 months more potentially outstanding. If the issue is the reporting, we should be able to document what reporting we're doing on that. If the issue is controls, hopefully we can document for you what the controls have been in place and address any of those going forward. So I think if you can help us with what question specifically you're trying to ask with one incremental month, then perhaps we can try and address that for you and get that piece of information to you to help raise your comfort level.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I'll go to Mr. Bolito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have 3 questions. The first one is, I would like to know what effect, if any, do the overruns have on our bond rating? Have the rating agencies said anything about this, or what do you anticipate, Mr. Hiller, that they're going to say about this?
Mr. Tetro and I have spoken with our financial advisor. We have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning with our financial advisor in preparation for a rating agency call, which is scheduled for Wednesday afternoon, July 6th. This is in anticipation of the note in which we will be selling on July 14th.
Right.
They obviously haven't commented at this time. We intend, obviously, to fully discuss it with them as to, and what plan of action this board and other bodies might be taking over the next 60 days.
Right. Now, and
Let's go to Mr. Tetro. I think
Okay,
he's
certainly.
got follow-up on it.
I think to more fully answer that, the issue is, this is not a standalone project.
right, understood.
What the rating agencies are going to do is view this in light of our total debt load and our total bonding payments. So I would suggest to you that the more important session will be the capital planning workshop we have in September.
Right.
Because the challenge then will be, based on where we stand with this and based on what's approved and where we're going, what adjustments do we make to our capital plan, and what limits do we allow our capital bonding to go up to comprehend this? Potentially, this has no bearing if we basically push everything off and make sure we maintain the $2 to $6 million and treat that as a separate project. We push off $2 to $6 million worth of projects.
You
There is no-
anticipated my second question, actually, because I was going to ask what impact this is going to have, not only on the 5-year capital plan, but the waterfall as well, so we'll definitely be getting into that.
Well, the
Good.
waterfall documents what we are planning to do. The capital plan, I would, workshop this year, I think would have increased importance, because I think some of the decisions we make there in terms of the bond and indebtedness we're going to take on will roll into the plans you talked about.
Right, okay. That's number 2. The third question was, if for some reason this appropriation is rejected by either this board or the RTM, what will the consequences be in terms of our contractual obligations, in terms of the project, in terms of the bond rating agency's outlook on it? That's another question I want answered.
Okay, so we'll do these answers when we actually have the
Yep.
appropriation before us. Okay,
Thanks.
sure. I want to go to other board members. Mr. Brockville, do you have anything at the present time? Mrs. Leclerc, do you have anything at the present time?
Well, are we asking for information right now?
Yes, we are.
Mr. Tetros? I do have some questions.
Feel free.
Okay. One is,
Actually, if I can, just to clarify the format again, is it, some of these have been questions we can answer right now because of what we've been through. Is that okay to do, or do you want us
It's
to?
absolutely okay to do, and then the others, I would like to get the questions all put together and have you answer them when you come back for the appropriation. And the only concern I have is if we answer a bunch of questions now, you're likely to get the same questions again when we come back in a month,
Yep.
based on any updated information. So we can take it either way you like, but I think we should move along.
I think if there are clarifications and process questions, to the extent that we can, let's get the information in your hand. And to
Exactly.
the extent that raises other questions, let's get to those and see if we can get that second-level group of questions
Exactly.
answered. Sorry, Mary.
right, what I think everyone's going to need to see is some sort of summary of how we got here, what changed in the 2 contracts, so we can have a full understanding of what changed from what we originally approved to the revised contract and now, so we understand how we got
That seems
to this
very
part.
reasonable.
And then the same thing with the original budget and the current budget. And then what I wasn't clear from your presentation the other night was, it seemed to be showing us the costs that were expended, but I didn't know if there were other costs that have already been appropriated that you know have already been spent, that we may not have paid for. Was that just showing what we've actually paid, or was it showing
The-
the whole thing, what's been appropriated? And,
Okay, the presentation the other night, we tried to establish very clear cutoffs. We took it all the way back to the acquisition of the property, so that was the total cost. So there weren't any cutoff issues from what date did we start, you know?
Okay.
So there wasn't any prior cost to that point. Then the second thing we did is as we were preparing that, we had to have a month-end cut in order to make sure we were consistent. So we picked April 30th because that was the data that we had at that point. If Mark were here this week, we would have been putting together the May 31st data as of this week. But so all the costs, when we said this money has been expended, when I made that statement Monday night, that was through April 30th.
Okay, and so that was actually cash paid out, or is it contracts, like, do we know we have a contract still outstanding?
Or a
that
bill,
has to be
right.
paid? Right, or a bill outstanding that's still. has to
Basically,
be
is it
paid.
cash out the door, or is it things that have been billed through that date, for work done through that date?
Well, that I'd have to ask Paul for. That's things we've been billed for through that date, I believe.
Can we confirm that? That was the same question I had, so thank you.
All right, then I defer to Mr. Hiller.
I believe, and I was not with Mr. Tetro in the preparation for the PowerPoint. We had some discussions last week on it, but I believe those numbers, the derivation of those numbers is actually the cash that has been paid out at this time.
Which would imply that there was more to be billed that hadn't been paid as of April 30th.
Well, I think I turned to Mrs. Bossi, I believe they were all, that those numbers are, I don't want to say 100%, but virtually all current through April 30th.
Yeah, but the question is it cash out the door as of April 30th, or is it actually work that was completed and should have been billed through
No,
April 30th?
I believe it's cash out the door.
I know what I gave to Mr. Barnhart was cash out the door. Whether he added anything that he might have had in hand, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Can we get a follow-up on this?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's one of your questions for us to follow up on, right?
Yes, please. Is it directly
It's a
related to
follow-up
this item?
to that question.
Mr. Leclerc, can I get it,
Sure.
please?
Mr. Tetro, to me, a lot of this is very confusing because it's not like we haven't run town projects before in this town. With the amount of over $200 million worth of school projects that we've done in the last 10 years, it seems as though we should have kind of been experts at this. So the question is, on your worksheets going forward, is there a way to put a column for encumbered but not paid? I mean, this is stuff that shows up on some of these school reports all the time, where we know that we've have an expense, but we haven't paid it. Cash out the door is one thing. That's kind of an easy number to do, because we do just count up add the checks up. But is there a way to keep track of stuff that we know we've committed to or to be paid, but is not paid yet? And Mr. Flynn seems to be wanting to jump in.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Mr. Tetra, and then
I
I'll,
was just going to say, certainly, I think that we should first establish what the number is that we're referring to, and then if we have to make that adjustment, we easily can.
It just seems as though that going forward, because clearly it doesn't seem to have been done before to this day, we should be adding that to whatever reporting we have and having the contractor assist us with that.
Yeah, I think that because the information in that report came from Mr. Barnhart, as Ms. Bossi said, we're not sure exactly. So, in fact, that may include the encumbered, as you're asking, or it may not. And I just want to clarify that. If it doesn't, responding to your request would be very appropriate. So we're not disagreeing.
just as an aside, in terms of a report format, I see Mrs. Ewing's here, and she and I served on a committee a number of years ago where we investigated some issues we had with one of the building projects. And we actually, within a report that committee issued, we'd actually put in place a recommended reporting form that could be of use for exactly this type of reason in the back of that report. So I'm sure there's a copy of it in the finance office. I'm sure, if not, I'm sure we can dig it up. But that might be of use for exactly this.
Can I stay on that point for?
Sure.
You opened up a can of worms, man.
Just,
Go ahead, Mr. Kyle.
just from a formatting perspective, I think if I'm hearing all the parties correctly here and putting my accounting hat on for a moment, I think it would be good for me to be able to see spent to date, defined as cash, checks written, out of pocket, out the door. The next bucket would be the encumbered, the accrued, the obligations that the work's been done, the invoices in the mail. We have to pay it for whatever reason. we're obligated. And the third bucket would be beyond that, what's expected that needs to be done to get us from that point to the end of the project. And then A plus B plus C equaling D would get you to your answer, I think. Is that kind of where you were going, Jim?
Exactly. Thank you for explaining it.
Can I have a question? Mike, when, in coming up with the 2 to 6 range, didn't you have to take that into consideration to the end of the project? I mean, it may not be split that way, but
Yeah, he would have almost.
Yeah, I think the end of the project number is not going to change. I think what is being asked here is just how much has the town written out in checks and how much have we obligated to that we just haven't written out in check. Literally, the bill is in the mail.
Well, you might, if that number is the expended and not the actual billed and incurred, your runway could be shorter than you thought because you've already incurred an expense and are therefore obligated to pay it. That's the issue. That's why it's, in my opinion, it's critical that you get to the bottom of exactly what that number represents, because your wall could be a lot sooner in terms of your appropriation, even though you're absolutely correct in terms of the total dollars wouldn't change.
I think we're all saying the same thing. I think we just need to wait till Tuesday morning and get the answer. The person with that answer is just not in the room.
If I could just add to that, there is an outstanding encumbrance to Guerrero Construction, who's the primary contractor on this, which remains on the books, and that's in excess, that still remains in excess of some $4 million right now, and that's after we've paid the 2.8 that I referred to a few moments ago.
Mrs. Leclerc, back to you.
Okay. I happened to drive by on last Saturday, and there was a full crew there working, but it looked like it was almost complete. So I guess what my question is are they working on overtime? Are we fast-tracking this project, or is it just that that's how their regular schedule is?
Well, if you think back to last winter, we lost a fair number of construction days. So in fact, they're working 6 days a week now there, all with a goal to get it open in October.
So are we paying overtime, though, and extra funds for that, or is it just part of their contract to get it done?
It's just part of their contract. As I explained on Monday night, this is a unit cost contract,
Okay.
so the faster they get the units done, the faster we pay them.
Mrs. Leclerc, anything else?
And
Can I
then,
have a follow-up to that, Mary? Just the same thing. Is there a provision in the contract that makes the developer get paid some type of premium if he finishes early?
Yes, there's an early completion bonus. So that the contract date is now through November 13th. If he finishes early, and let's say in October, there is a bonus for that.
And do we have any idea of how far he is along and whether he's going to be entitled to that bonus?
He's not fully committing to that, but we are expecting him to be entitled to that.
Not entitled, but do you know that he, at this point in time, from your investigation that you've had over this period of time, do you believe he's going to be finishing early and entitled to a bonus?
Yes, I do.
Do you have any idea what that amount's going to be, or an estimate of what that's going to be? Because clearly, that's going to be in addition to what we thought the contract was going to be.
I believe the project to complete estimates that we put together would include an estimate for that bonus.
Okay.
However, the simplifying, I think, to answer the questions, if we can jot that down as a question point.
Sure.
We'll get back with the bonus arrangement, how it's structured, so you can better evaluate that, and also clarify whether it was in the completion numbers from the Monday night.
Yeah, it'd be great if, going forward, if once these worksheets are prepared, if we should have a line item for that, that if you have been, if he's telling you he's going to be 30 days early, that we have that number in that report, so we know what it is.
Kevin, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Walsh, follow up to your point, it would be good to know what that number is in case, worst case, the possibility is he's in a position to earn that money, yet town bodies slow the project down. From the vendor's perspective, there could be potential liability on our part for slowing the work down and precluding him from earning that bonus, and it'd be nice to know what that potential liability could be to us.
I agree with that. It also might be good to work with this vendor to see whether we can get it done then on time so that we don't become liable for something else on top of the problems we're already facing today, if we've had a good relationship with that vendor.
Yeah, I think there were two different questions, but if I understand Mr. Kiley's correctly, I think we're going to answer that at the same time we'd answer Mr. Bolito's about what would happen if we stop work on the project. Because that would be part of the termination
Yep.
clause and termination. The second question would be what happens if we slow it down, and we're basically going back and exploring both those situations right now.
Thank you. Go back to Mrs. Leclerc.
This, I know you don't have probably available today, but what I'd like to know is the status of BlackRock Realty's bankruptcy, and because part of the original driving point of this project was to bring in some tax revenue for us, and to have that development, the personal property taxes and the real estate taxes. So I want to know whether he's going to be completing his project, and or he's going to be able to finish that, and what the status of that piece of the project is.
Okay, the quick answer is that I believe it was a foreclosure as opposed to a bankruptcy.
Okay, sorry.
No, that was pointed out to me whenever I called it a bankruptcy.
Okay.
And then second, he is actively pursuing clients now, so I think that he's interested in filling it out as soon as possible. You know, how soon does he fill it all out? I don't know how to answer that, but I know he is actively pursuing clients right now and has some interest out there for that.
Okay.
Mrs. Leclerc, anything else?
I think I'm good for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brown?
My three questions were touched on, but Mary did bring up a point about revenue, and which reminds me of the parking fees. And there was a press report that Mr. Flato mentioned that he doesn't believe that we will not get the parking fees, that there's a 50-50 chance. So just, when will we know, and is that right, or is that definitely out?
The way it's structured right now, I would suggest that it's definitely out. The way the agreement was restructured last April said that the state gets to pay 100% of the costs of operating the station, and then gets to take the straight line principal for $19.4 million, which is roughly $1 million a year, and then pay us $300,000. So they have to get $1 million plus the operating cost of the train station. I have not seen a pro forma on what the expenses are to operate the station, but there are going to be 1,200 parking spaces there. For permits, about another 200 for day parking. So then the question becomes, what are the permits for those? And again, I haven't seen the permit, the pro forma for that in terms of what the state expects to charge, but I assume it would be something along the lines of the Fairfield Parking Authority.
Okay.
When you multiply that out, there's not that much money left over.
Okay. And just, we went around on this, but the question that I did have was, are there, and I believe you said you were going to get us this information, but are there outstanding invoices that cannot be paid? Or is there currently work being done that we cannot pay unless we pass this resolution?
No.
Okay. So all the invoices were okay? So this is, we're okay up to August? is what we're
Yes.
saying. Okay.
You know, given where we are and given how the work is going, you know, I can't give you it's August 23rd or August 24th. It's not down to the day, but we're definitely going to look at kind of how we manage that based on this approval process that we're going through.
Thank you.
Sure. Please, Mr. Brockville.
Just a quick follow-up, because I just didn't understand clearly. On the parking revenue, just to make sure I understood it, the state gets the first $1,000,000-odd a month in revenue to offset their costs? Is that what you're
No.
approximately? Okay. If you could just clarify that.
There are two expense components that are taken out on an annual basis before the town would get $1. 100% of the operating costs for the station. As I mentioned, I don't have any pro forma. There wasn't any in the contract, and there wasn't any in the side letter that dealt with this. 2, part of the operating costs were redefined last April as part of this contract to include the $19.4 million. $19.4 million over 20 years is roughly $1 million a year. $950, I think, is what.
So doing any rudimentary back-of-the-envelope calculation, as you said, doesn't yield us anything from that part.
Well, let's take, there are 1,200 parking spaces plus 200 daytime. Let's take 2,000 parking spaces.
Let's, instead of doing the back of the envelope, though, I appreciate that. We have Mr. Hiller, and Mr. Flato was kind enough to join us. Gentlemen, I would ask, do you have any pro forma that was done? Please feel free, Mr. Flato, come on up to the mic.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate that. I think the simplest pro forma to get is the Fairfield Parking Authority's revenues from downtown. I believe they receive almost $2 million a year from the combination of parking permits, day parking, and fines. So, in my opinion, maybe $1.5 million, I might be wrong, but in my opinion, there's as much chance of getting that $300,000 at the end of the day as not. There is less chance than there was before this bond was issued.
Right.
So, with all due respect, and I appreciate the First Selectman's thoughts on it, I think we're not going to know for 1.5 years. It depends on how much the parking, fees are. If it's higher like Bridgeport, if it's lower, we get less. It's a new station, it's not going to have very many costs. Obviously, there's no repair costs, hopefully. So it really depends. And if you don't mind, by just finishing one last thought, what's kind of, for me, ironic is, as some of you know, I actually negotiated that provision 10 years ago to try to get that revenue. There's no agreement the state's made in its history to give a municipality back a sharing of revenues that the state is due, and that was a precedential negotiation. And many, when they approved the original $6 million, said, we know we can't count on that $300,000 a year. The perception was we would spend $6 million with a hope of getting $300,000 a year back. I would personally believe it's still a 50-50 chance. I believe it would have been almost 100% certainty if the state did not have to give the town $19 million. But as of right, the state could have declared that an operating cost. So yes, they said, we will not give you the money unless you agree it's an operating cost, and we believe it's an operating cost because it's part of our, and I actually have a handout I'll pass out to you, but the original language of the $300,000 is in here, and it just says, the town will get $300,000 after the operating maintenance expenses and the expenses of the state for the surface parking area and its improvements. So it was very clear that what they asked us last April, they were already entitled to, but they wanted a further certification from me, from the town, that we agreed with that interpretation. By the way, when I started that discussion last April, and I promised I wouldn't talk too much, today is my birthday, I came and delaying my dinner for that. But when we discussed that last spring, they actually wished to take that $300,000 away from the town, and I said, that's part of the three-party agreement. I don't feel comfortable doing that, and we discussed and debated that for weeks, and they agreed not to take that $300,000 away, but to include this wording. So, we did the best we could to try to give a chance for the town to get that $300,000, which originally I was happy to negotiate.
Okay, Mr. Flato, first of all, happy birthday.
Thank you.
And thank you again for joining us.
And I will pass these around. for you.
Now I'll go back to cocktail napkin math for a second, if I might. What are the annual operating costs, do we know, of the downtown train station? That does not come before us. Mr. Hiller, do you know?
We get their audit, we have full access to their books, obviously, and I don't want to just arbitrarily, we will get that information for you as to what it is, as far as what their total income is and what their operating costs are.
Well, they've got $2 million a year that they get in revenue, let's say, from Mr. Flato. Do they run a surplus, or are they at a deficit?
They've been running a slight surplus. I'm not certain on their full revenue figures. Obviously, they do have
Well, let's
two
do
primary
this.
sources of income, obviously through fees, daily fees and
Right, if we do a
frankly,
P&L.
semi-annual fees, and they also have some rental income from the properties with tenants on the South Side Station in Fairfield and at the restaurant in Southport.
No. What I'm trying to do is, if we just limit it to the train station downtown, if their revenues are between $1.5 and $2 million, and they're running a slight surplus, okay, you could surmise that the operating expenses for the new train station, using Mr. Flato's logic, would be similar. And then you turn around and you add $1 million worth of interest and principal obligation on top of that on an annual basis, and I'd say that the opportunity to get back any of the $300,000 on an annual basis is slim to none while you're paying down the interest and principal.
We can work on a pro forma based on that information.
Can we do that?
As you're aware, they do pay the town, particularly on the main lot.
Yeah.
They do pay a rental fee, and they also pay an operating maintenance fee, which includes some of the services, including the plowing and the,
I would assume that the new station's going to pay that same.
yeah, it's going to, someone's going to have to plow it, someone's going to have to sand it and remove the sand, et cetera.
Right.
They paid their bonds every year for 20 years. The bonds finished about a year ago, and the town now gets a large payment from them. The difference is they spend all their repairs, everything repairs that have to be done, they just put in about $700,000 last year.
Right.
So they're taking care
They
of the
have a
train
surplus, so they
stations
have a side.
and
Yeah.
all that.
Okay.
But it's a fair question, and I wish I could have been at the RTM to help explain and answer as best I could. I'm sorry I couldn't have been there.
I appreciate you being here tonight. So we're going to ask for a pro forma P&L regarding parking revenue. And the new agreement. And pay down of the interest and principal, I'm assuming, correct? Okay. That'd be another good to have for our discussion when this is before us. I appreciate that. Thank you. Mr. Brown, any other
Can I have
comments?
a follow-up to that question, Mr. Flynn?
You can.
Just to the
Yeah, absolutely.
First Selectman. I just want to be clear about what right now, the reading of these agreements is that beforehand, the first thing that was being paid out of that revenue from the parking was operating expenses. Then we got our $300,000, and then the state got whatever was left?
Yes.
And now, under the new agreement from April 2010, they get operating expenses, they get their amortized amount for the 19.4, and then we're third in line if there's anything left to get 300, and then anything above that, it goes back to the state again.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Brown?
On a separate subject. We ready to move, Mary, you were about to raise
Mrs.
your hand?
Leclerc, did you have a follow-up to that same topic? Feel free.
It's on the handout, but that's it.
Okay. Go ahead.
Just on the soil removal, all viable options on the soil removal. Just because Mr. Flato said he thinks there's more than one option in not removing it at all, and then on the other extreme is removing all of it based on drainage, like you said, and other issues. So if there's any, and maybe it's 50/50, maybe there's something else we can do, maybe there's a way to reduce that $2 million estimate, whatever we can come up with.
Please, feel free, Mr. Tetra.
Yeah, going back to the presentation Monday night, the estimate was 0 to 2 million, because there are all those options. If it can, as I described Monday night, if we can work with BlackRock and find a home for that on site, the cost is 0.
You know when you'll know that, or when we will know that?
No, I don't. Those discussions and looking at that are underway. If we can move it off someplace closer as opposed to other options, it may not cost us fully. So we're exploring every one of those options, but as of Monday night, because those were not decided, and we didn't have agreement, that's why there was a range. It may be 0.
Follow-up to that.
Okay.
Mr. Brockfeld has a follow-up.
Just a quick follow-up to Mike. One confused thing, why would the cost be 0? In other words, it still has, if I understand your presentation from the other night, it was complex, and I don't understand all this, but this is the dirt that is in between, right? The 1 to 10 parts per million?
Yeah, think of it as incremental cost,
Oh, okay, it's already budgeted?
that the excavation is already in the numbers that we gave you, that moving it somewhere is already in the numbers we gave you. If we can drop it on site, we don't have to truck it off site. We don't have to find a site that'll hold it, that type of thing. So it's the incremental cost of moving off site that we're really talking about.
Thank you.
And it's, I'm sorry, Tom.
Yeah,
And
please.
It's budgeted, or, I'm using the word budgeted, it's already budgeted in because we expected to find this amount of dirt? In other words, one of the things you mentioned, I use the word dirt, soil, is that we find the soil, we remove it, we test again, then we have to keep doing that until we get a clean bill of health, right?
We're talking about the 22,000, or 12,500 cubic yards, so about approximately 20,000 tons, all right? If we eliminate that, let's say that goes to zero, then you take the presentation from Monday night and say, hey, we're in the 2 to 4 range.
Okay.
The reason this is driving up to 6, and the zero basically says, no, the excavation of this amount is already in the 2 to 4. If we have to truck it off-site, that's what might cause it to go beyond that.
And if we, Tom?
Please.
And if we were to, if they were to test and continue to say we needed to keep doing more removal? I apologize, I think I just don't understand some of the science. I'm blending science and math, that's the
Now,
problem.
just
but-
help me out then. What,
No, I mean, because we're trying to come up with some sort of finite number, 0 to 2 million. 0 if we can keep it on site, 2 if we have to truck all of it off, right?
correct.
But what is the assumption in terms of how much of this contaminated soil we're going to need to keep moving? Are we at the point?
12,500 cubic yards.
Right, and is that a final number? In other words, has the testing?
That's our best estimate at the moment.
Okay, but it could go higher.
It could go to 12,600 yards. We don't think it's going to go to 20,000 yards. No, it's close enough that we think it's 12,500 yards.
And that's based on estimates by the professional
Construction
testers?
folks on site.
Okay.
yes.
Okay. I'm going to go back, Mr. Brown, you're good? I'm going to go back to Mr. Bolito. You had some follow-ups.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tetro, you had mentioned during your presentation on Monday that you were anticipating hiring a construction manager, an independent construction manager. What I'm going to want to know either today or when we do the follow-up meeting, when you do the appropriation, what's the cost going to be to hire that individual? What's the process going to be to select that individual? And also, what exactly are they going to be managing? Are they going to be looking back at the process to date and seeing where we went wrong, or is it just going to be someone to basically bring us home to the finish line with this particular project?
On this case, we're, have gotten a half dozen names already of folks we're starting to talk to. The idea is to bring the person on as soon as possible. We are exploring the costs. I don't have those numbers at the moment. His goal will be to bring us home as close to the low end of these numbers as we can.
Right.
And make sure we finish on time.
Now, if we're anticipating that this project, at least this portion of it, will be completed in November, because we're talking about the performance bonus to the general contractor for finishing on time, we're essentially talking about several months' worth of work to manage, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Second question is about the soil and about the dispute between BlackRock Realty and the town. Obviously, there's some dispute in terms of what the parties' idea of what their contractual obligations are, Ray, this pile of soil. What I would like to know from our town attorney is what his legal opinion is about the potential for litigation on this issue, and also if he feels that we're on solid legal ground as far as saying that this is BlackRock Realty's problem and not the town's problem as far as putting it on site.
Okay. Mr. Chair, if I could ask your help on this?
Yes.
Since this is an ongoing construction project, all the parties are currently players in it. I think discussing in a public forum the potential for litigation and a litigation strategy might be detrimental to the town and also detrimental to the project finishing on time and anywhere
Private executive
close to
session,
budget.
then.
Let's take it offline, and we might ask for a private executive session to hear some of this information before we vote on it. Okay?
Fair enough. Thank you.
I'm going to open this up. I'm going to ask any of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Walsh, I see you're still here. You tried to run out on me, I know. I got you. Mary, please, while we wait for Jim.
Sorry. I had one quick question on the handout that we just received, and it's minutes from our June 1st, 2010 meeting, and there had been a update on the train station. And in it, it says that Mr. Flato informed the board that any costs over $28 million will be the responsibility of the town. The state will not spend more than $19 million that had been approved for this project. Options may be to scale back plans if the costs come near the $28 million mark. So I guess that's what I want to know is what were the options and do they still exist?
I'm happy to, if it's okay
Please.
with the chair.
Yes,
There
Mr.
were
Flato.
a few early options that we had. For example, in the contract documents, there's an option not to complete the parking area of the parking lot under what's to be hopefully known as the train depot building. That's about 250 to 200 spaces worth of the 1,500 parking spaces that it could be left in completed condition. There also were possible issues of a sewer line. Unfortunately, that was, the contractor felt that had to be put into the first part of the project, so those options I know have been expended. There was a sewer line needed to feed the parking lot, but there was a debate as to how much it would benefit and how far it goes for the goodwill of the developer, and I won't get into that tonight. So there were things like that. I don't know, and I suggested, as the first selectman knows, we chatted over the weekend, there are a couple of expert consultants that have been very active in developing these plans that I'd suggested, having those discussions with to see if there are any remaining options to try to save a little bit of money.
Are you all set?
Thank you.
Any other comments? I'm going to go over to the Board of Selectmen for any questions that they have that they'd like addressed at this, either now or at our follow-up meeting. And Deb, I trust that we can get a listing of these questions. Deb, I trust we can get a listing of these questions to make sure that we provide them to the administration. And my goal would be to go right down this list of questions at our follow-up meeting.
I've had a lot of questions over the last 6 to 8 weeks, so I think I've been questioned out. My two main concerns were the auditor and getting the professional project manager so that you can minimize the damage.
Thank you very much, and we will, after this, we will bring up, I've asked for Mr. Centrofani from our audit firm to be here, and we'll bring him up and have a further discussion over a potential scope of a project, should we move forward with that. So thank you for that. Mr. Walsh, back to you.
Following up on Selectman Stenick's comments and also the comments that were made regarding this construction manager, I think it's imperative that we get somebody on this as soon as possible, even if it involves special meetings of our board, the Board of Finance, and the RTM to approve whatever funds we need to get somebody on board right now. Mr. Barnhart is not a construction manager. We should have had a construction manager on this job from day one. This is a huge project. We have people like this all the time that are on school projects and whatever, and I think that's got to be really, if we're going to close out this project in some form of good way for the town of Fairfield, we need some professional expertise that's working for us, including working with the developer to find a home for some of this stuff and suggesting other avenues and things like that. So I think that's almost like one of the first priorities that we need to get and get somebody on board soon. So, I don't know how the Board of Finance wants to handle that, whether we want to get to the point of starting to authorize money, whether you guys are going to want to have a special meeting or whatever, but we're all going to have to come together to try to at least get somebody in place, because preferably by those times those July numbers come, I'd like to be hearing from a construction manager on that almost.
Thank
to
you.
tell us. Thanks.
Mr. Walsh. Mr. Tetra, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I agree 100% with Mr. Walsh. We have started talking to folks today. We have resumes coming in. We're going to get that person on board as soon as possible. That will be an experienced person. That's part of what we're vetting. It's my understanding that, this comes out, is done as fees and professional services, so there's no big approval process. We can just hire them and get them on board.
Great.
And
Second,
that's already accounted for in the numbers that you put forth on Monday night?
it is not.
It is not?
It is not.
So it would be in addition to those numbers?
It is not to the extent that it's not going to be outside the
Specifically
$6 million
identified. Right.
range. It's in the 2 to 4 range on that, certainly. And the goal is this person's going to help us hit the low end of that. So from that standpoint, the dollars, the plan now is to take them out of the project since it's part of the project administration, and that's typically where you would charge those dollars.
I agree with that. No. Mr. Walsh, back to you.
Sure. I'd like to have Senator McKinney, who's present, who just came in, come up. He just gave me some information, which I think could be helpful in regards to possibly finding another home for possibly some of these castings and things like that, so.
Senator McKinney, welcome. Welcome.
I had a conversation with a colleague just this afternoon and put a call into DEP. I don't know if it's feasible or not, just perhaps a potential option for the soil is that there was a situation in Hamden with contaminated soil, and at the same time, there was a landfill that was being closed and capped. And in order to close and cap a landfill, you have to come in with X number of feet of fill, and you have to pay for that fill. What they did in this situation was they used about 4 feet of the contaminated soil and then a couple of feet of fill. That significantly reduced their cost of buying real fill, and they basically took the contaminated soil from Hamden and paid for the cost of trucking it off because they didn't have to pay for the fill. I know DEP keeps a list of sites that are looking to be closed or need to be filled in-state and out-of-state, New York, New Jersey, et cetera. And so I'm certainly willing to put in a call to DEP to see if that's something that could work here. Again, I don't know what the possibilities are. It may depend on how contaminated the soil is and a lot of other variables, but it looks like it might at least be an option that's worth exploring, and I wanted to at least tell you about that possibility and tell you that I would look into it.
Thank you, Senator.
One, Senator, thank you, and certainly any help there would be greatly appreciated. I was talking with somebody this afternoon, and we were exploring that option. I think there's a landfill up by Rocky Hill that they're talking about reopening along the same lines. The second issue we're exploring is given this is the fill in that kind of 1 to 10 range, so it's not the 10 that has to go off, but that 1 to 10, can we in fact mix it, in essence,
Dilute it?
This is not the technical term, water it down, exactly right, and then use that in other construction sites, because that might be another option. So we're exploring a lot of alternatives in doing that, but we will take all the help we can get, Senator. Thank you very much.
And I will call DEP tomorrow, and I guess whatever conversations I have with them, I think probably the person to go back to is Mike.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator. Can we make sure we have that as a follow-up item as to what the status of those discussions are for our meeting? It'd actually be great to have a complete listing at that time, best available information of what the current view is on disposal of that dirty soil, as it were. Mr. Brockfeld?
Just one comment on top of that. First of all, thanks, Senator McKinney, for the idea and for working on it. But if there was any question as to whether or not we need a project manager, and should have had one, this would be a perfect example of it. There's no reason why an idea like this should only come forward because there's a crisis. This strikes me, and I know nothing about construction and a job of this sort, but this strikes me as a normal way that one would consider disposing of the contaminated soil. And there's no response necessary, Mike. I'm just saying that if anybody has any question as to why we need a construction manager, this would be a perfect example. An experienced construction manager would have thought of this already, I assume, regardless of whether or not we were having financial difficulties.
The only comment I'd make is we're not sure it hasn't been thought of already.
Well, within this project, it seems to be the first time we've heard of it. That's
You don't know that.
That's true.
Because we've been trucking off a lot of soil, you don't know where it's gone. There's a list of sites that I don't have. So I'm not suggesting I can answer that question tonight. All I'm saying is very much appreciate the Senator's thoughts. We need his help, and certainly finding additional sites for that would be helpful. But trucking it off has been one of the costs involved with that.
They've already trucked off.
Right,
so
so
they
which gives
might
me an
have
idea for an additional question to put on Debbie's list, which
Please.
is that if soil has been trucked off, it would be nice to know where it's gone and if, in fact, it's been paid for as opposed to us paying to have it taken away. Hypothetically, if you're saying that it might have been thought of or done already. And
Most
where
of
that money might have
the
gone.
soil trucked off site so far has been heavily PCB contaminated, so we've had to pay for that to be taken off. And there's only specific sites that can go to. Senator's referring to, and at least I was referring to, and I believe the Senator's referring to the partially contaminated stuff that potentially we can dilute or use underneath a seal. And so we are exploring those options.
Thank you. We'll go back over to Mr. Walsh to make sure he has his questions.
Mr. Tetra, did you say earlier that we were getting reimbursed by the state at a rate of about 80%?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll ask Mr. Flato, because in a January 24, 2011 report to the RTM, you state that we're getting paid at a 90% of such costs to date. Was there a change in the reimbursement rate that the state was giving us?
I honestly don't recall that comment, but I can tell you that Mr. Barnhart, in about the third or fourth month of the process of starting the costs, as they started increasing, the inspectors started, because of the rate at speed at which Guerrero was moving, the inspectors were starting to get behind on submitting reports to the state. The state said, we are only going to start reimbursing, I don't remember the timing, but we're going to reimburse at 80%. That's not to say they're not going to pay the rest, but they wanted to have a holdback until they had a chance to audit the bills. And the grant doesn't have any conditions. Any construction-related costs are eligible for reimbursement. So it may have changed during that period. I don't remember when it was, Jim, but there was, I do remember, a healthy dialogue between Mark and the DOT District 3 office about it, because, you know, we were concerned about them reducing that by 10%.
The timing on getting the remaining 20% back, to the extent, Mike or Ken, you know, what is that timing, and what happens with that float time? Does the town of Fairfield have to advance that remaining money, and then we have to hope we get it back?
I don't believe it so much as, well, yes, we're floating the money, all right, because we're basically doing the work and then applying for reimbursement, so we have paid ahead of time. All right, just analogous to a school reimbursement project. Because this is smaller and doesn't have quite the overhead of the SFU organization that you and I cut our teeth on, so to speak, it's not taking quite as long, but there is a delay in doing that. As Mr. Flato pointed out, STV is specifically reviewing the construction for the state to make sure that we're doing it properly and that the work was actually done. So that as with Guerrero working 6 days a week and STV working 5 days a week, that's been one of the schedule glitches. We are a bit behind in doing that, so.
Who's monitoring that process? Just like on the SFU, we started asking questions about who was monitoring the process, and we found basically nobody. Or, you know, between the Board of Ed and the town side, it was kind of a very confusing thing, and not a lot of people were coordinating that process, and that's how we fell behind. And we ran into statutory issues that our state delegation was able to help out with. But who is monitoring that process? And, like, to know that we're, say the town of Fairfield's $500,000 advanced on that, and we're, you know, who's monitoring? Are there spreadsheets on this, or how's that being monitored?
Mr. Barnhart's monitoring that along with our finance department.
And
Okay.
if I could help, if you
This
don't mind,
is-
for 30 seconds on this?
Yes, you can. This is something that I think we definitely want the independent
I'd like to,
auditors
yeah, I'd like to have them take a look at it, and I'd also like to see those reports.
Thanks. If I could just help a little bit,
Please.
because Mike might not be aware in only a few weeks. Actually, as an accountant background, I actually helped set up that process. What we did was, we allocated the other 20% to BlackRock Realty's $5 million. So actually, we were trying to 100% reimburse us as far as we could, and have the town monies played out at the end of the process. So actually, we were ahead of the game. We were trying to hold back our remaining $5 million of our $6 million. But at this point, most of, as Mike said, you know, most of the BlackRock money has been paid over, so now more town money will be expended. But anyway, that's the short answer. But Mark has been doing that after I left.
Thank you, Mr. Flato.
I'd like to see some of those reports regarding the reimbursement process, to see how much we've put in for and how much we've gotten back so far and what's outstanding on that.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Walsh, any other thoughts on your end?
Not at this time.
Okay, and I'll go back to the rest of the board, or to the Board of Selectmen for any other comments. Seeing none, I suggest we put together that list of questions and items that we'd like to address. We'll circulate that list amongst the board to make sure that that's fine. And then we'll submit that to Mr. Tetro for his administration. And we hope to have those questions answered for the meeting, the forthcoming meeting, when that is forthcoming. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn our attention to the second part of the agenda, which is, and I'd like to ask our independent auditor to come forward to us at the at the table. You can sit with Mr. Flato.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask?
Please, Mr.
I
Flato.
was hoping to help answer two other questions that came up.
Please.
If I could, and
I'd
I promise
appreciate
not
that.
to hog public comment, because I know this is unusual, and I appreciate your willingness to let me.
Yeah,
Hey, Joe.
let me address that up front. Mr. Flato was kind enough to have a discussion with me this morning and volunteered to come tonight and work with the board, given the unique position he's in of having a vast amount of information about this project prior to his appointment to the state position. So I had agreed that it would be beneficial for him to take part as a participant in this discussion, and that's why I've accorded Mr. Flato the opportunity to come up and sit at the table and address us and partake in the discussion in Q&A, and I thank you for coming tonight. So
And I'll
go right
make
ahead.
this very relatively brief, I promise. Just two quick things. To Mary's question about the foreclosure with BRR, part of our agreement in April required, and this was actually a state requirement, the bank gave BRR full release from that foreclosure proceeding. It's no longer outstanding, and they are a bona fide, enterprise, at least as far as I know, but the foreclosure is no longer, and the bank has been a partner with them in this process, at least since last April. As far as the rating agency, just a quick comment. In my experience, what really the rating agencies have said to Paul and I, and I'm sure the first selectman will hear it, is that this project being the generator of the biggest revitalization in our town, they see it as a potential for economic revitalization and grand list growth in the whole area, and they have been dying to hear that it's going to get finished. So I think that'll be what their concern is, how fast will it open. What I tried to do, and I'm not going to go into describing this, this is not a town document, this is not anything that, this is my own stab, and I have a few copies for the press, but this is just my own stab at a little bit of history. I thought it would be helpful just to try to put it in perspective, to show you what the project looked like in anticipated project costs 10 years ago and how it changed over the 10 years. A lot of the estimates that were assumed when the town boards, all of us assumed $6 million, those numbers skyrocketed between the conservation process, the DEP permit requirements, the cost of, concrete, everything. So I tried to put together a kind of, what did it look like back 10 years ago? None of this, some of this can be documented, some of this is my best guess. So I'm just asking you to take it with a grain of salt. I tried my best over the last 2 days to help put together a picture. You can see that the costs, unfortunately, appear to have gone up, across the board in significant leaps and bounds based on a whole series of factors, not the least of which is the remediation and the parking lot reconstruction, which, by the way, included the town remediation requirements in the parking area. That was separate from the Black Rock remediation. So I tried to put it together for you to get a flow for it. I tried to use the first selectman's numbers, although I was on the optimistic side of hopefully only a $2 million overrun. But what I was trying to get at really was that if you look at the big picture and a potential $40 million plus what the state paid for platforms and the bridge, a 5% overage or underage is a pretty good picture, as much as I'm frustrated and you're frustrated that this is happening. It's not a crazy picture in this type of complex construction project. So what I wanted to try to get across was that out of that money, for the town to have a $6 million exposure and possibly 8 or 9, hopefully no more than that, out of that $40 million, the town is the junior financial player in this transaction. The town gets most of the benefits, the region, but the town lays the least out. The state has put up more than anybody. Black Rock Realty has put up the second largest amount, and the town has put up the least in this transaction. When we negotiated 10 years ago, the first thing the state tried to do, and last April in 2010, they were trying to get it 30%, 30%, 33, 33, 33. We tried very hard to say, we can't afford that. We're a community. You're a big state. You're a developer that's going to make a profit. So I'm not going to give you a soliloquy, but I thought this might be helpful to you to provide some information in the context of what Mike was presenting and to see where the grants came from. I'm very proud that we received these grants. I worked very hard to receive all these grants. The $19 million was no small feat. And I think John and McKinney can attest to how much everybody worked, the state delegation, to try to get that money to help get this project done, because unfortunately the project would have been long gone and over 2 years ago if we didn't accept that money under their conditions. And then the last quick thing, I'll just say, please understand, yes, we all try to put things in the best perspective, but there is no information that I had in terms of this final iteration of costs 3 months ago or 2 months ago. In fact, I had a meeting with incoming First Selectman Sherry Stenick on April 28th. My notes say Dick Saxel was there, Tom Bremer was there. We spent over an hour. And the main thing we talked about was the issue of dirt that was being found in BlackRock Realty's area in the north part of the site that was having to be shipped down to the south part of the site because it was going below what the plans said we had to do, but the environmental consultant said the DE permit required us to keep cleaning out that dirt in that part of the site. And I was incredibly frustrated, not because it was going over budget, and Sherry might remember this conversation, but because it ate up the underage. We were $2 million under budget in the winter, and this was eating it up. So I was very frustrated and asking an awful lot of questions. Unfortunately, that process apparently continued, and as they hit the shoreline, my guess is there was a lot more of this. But there was no knowledge of a overrun. There was no documented overrun. There was worry. Mark was worried, but we did not have any evidence yet. And Guerra had given me an estimate in early April that showed that we were pretty much close to budget, but not under budget the way we had been. So I'm sorry for the confusion. I'm as frustrated as you. I understand RTM members were, and I wish I was there to help explain this. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Fleto. Ms.
Yes.
Stenick?
Yes, we did. I did hear about dirt that day, excess soil. However, when I asked about that, I said, is there a problem with this? And it was as if there was nothing wrong, and how from the 28th to like a week after I'm there, all of a sudden there's 22,000 cubic yards of dirt that needs to go somewhere. It was more than just a little bit of a problem. And there was, Mark and I spoke at length right after that, and it was clear that he had been discussing the dirt, and there had been a plan on what you were intending to do with the dirt, which wasn't where it was supposed to go, but you had a plan for that because that was what was on the drawing. So you were intending to do something with it, but it wasn't ship it off, and it wasn't put it where it was supposed to go. So
And just a quick comment, since you brought it up, Ms. Stenick. The plan was, as you heard, was to put the extra dirt that they had found along the buffer between the shoreline of Cleanfill and BlackRock Realty's property. There was a band of land that Mark and the contractors figured out could take extra soil. And what I've been told at that point was most of the extra soil fit there, and there was a small amount that had to go potentially into the parking courtyard of BlackRock Realty, and we had started talking with Mr. Whittick about that in mid-April. But the significant quantities that now are there were not known at that point, to my knowledge. At least that's the way I had been briefed by my staff. If there was more information that you got a few weeks later, we can get into.
Well, it's probably hard to have that information. I'm sorry.
But I just, that's as far as I knew.
It's hard to have that information when there's not somebody keeping structured records of what's going on, and, that's beyond the scope of the economic development director. So having a professional there to do the job that needs a professional probably would have accommodated that.
I don't disagree. That was what hopefully STV was doing, as the inspector oversight on the project was supposed to give us all that expertise. But
I think it does come to the point, and I think this is a nice segue for Mr. Centrovani. Thank you, Mr. Fleto, to be here, because one of the items it'd be great to address.
Well, can I address something that he said?
Sure.
I guess the question I have is, why at the time was not a construction manager not appointed onto the job? I mean, based on the document that I just have been reading this week regarding the 2010 agreement, we take on full responsibility as project manager. I mean, those terms are actually used in the document. And on one of the largest, if not the largest, project the town has ever undertaken. And why don't we hire somebody who has construction experience, a construction manager, to do the job, as opposed to give it to a guy who's an economic development guy?
we did, Jim, hire what I considered a manager. We spent $1 million over the last year in a contract that was bid out by Ms. Holland to hire an inspector and engineering company to monitor the work, to report on the work, to to attest everything, to track things, and to give us ideas as to anywhere they could save or do things better. That firm, STV Engineering, is a fairly large firm. They have been on the site every day. They actually do have oversight in terms of anything Guerra has to do on that site, they have to get STV's permission for. So Mark had a company working for him in that role. Were they a construction manager per se? Not totally. But were they given the role to help do that job? That's the way we had viewed it. And I'm sure they did just do some good stuff in many instances. But as far as reports, things like that, I think Mike's idea about trying to get somebody in here now as a third party is fine. And, this was all happening very quickly, and maybe we should have done that.
Was
Had somebody else.
STV's scope of work in their contract, this $1 million contract that we bid, say that they had some construction management responsibilities?
There's wording in there as to what their responsibilities are. I'm sure Mike could get you a copy of their contract that describe their oversight responsibilities.
Is it your opinion, based on where we are right now and what you've seen while you were first selectman, that they did not honor their side of the bargain?
I cannot attest to that. I can tell you they did get behind in reports at one point. They were having trouble keeping up with the contractor schedule. Mark had a lot of conversations with them. I would say they have some very good people. I'd have to really, defer to Mark more because he really worked with them closely. But I would say that all those issues should be looked at closely as to how we got here over the last 3 or 4 months to see each person's role.
Was STV giving us weekly, monthly reports on either the scope of the work or?
Yes, STV has a weekly construction meeting that they run. They hear reports from all the contractor personnel. They hear reports from Bill Kinney, from Gary Weddle when he comes. They hear from the Lorero Engineering, Brian Cutler. They get everybody in a room every week. Mark Barnhart goes over there once a week, and they run the meeting. STV is in charge of all that. They're in charge of tracking the progress. They're in charge of everything. They have reports, I'm sure. I was getting my information from Mark on about a monthly basis, roughly month and a half. But my understanding is they have zillions of documents. You'd have to ask Mark. I only went to about 3 of those weekly meetings. Whenever I felt there was an issue that I heard was brewing, and there were a few in the first 6 months too, I like getting the right-of-way off Black Rock Turnpike to build the road that we didn't have enough space for. I got involved. But yes, STV had a very significant responsibility.
When was the first time that someone, whether it be
Still does.
STV or someone else, reported to you that we had an excess amount of contaminated soil?
I did not hear that from the vendors. I heard that from Mark. And that's when we brought Guerra in, and then 3 weeks later, we met with Sherry about it.
So STV never was updating us on that there seemed to be a problem with
I'd have to ask Mark, Jim.
22,000 tons of contaminated soil just kind of slipped by them?
Well, again, it was not. It was 8,000 or 10,000 when I was there. But at least to my knowledge, that's what I was told. But the role of STV was to report to Mark Barnhart. He was their project manager for the town. Bill Hurley also attended on a weekly basis many of those meetings. Mark and Bill were the people I appointed to be my town staff to manage the project with STV and to oversee the contractors. But again, you can get those contracts and all that stuff.
I think one of the things that I'm going to want, and why I'd like this audit, is I'd like to see what form reports they were providing. And it's very common to have weekly meetings on something like that, but it's also common for, as a result of those meetings, to be a written report of the bullet point items that were addressed at that meeting. So I'd like to see that, assuming we go forward with this review, that we have those bullet point reports and can figure it out. I think that's going to be, for purposes of moving forward with the project, we're going to want to know that that's happening and that those written weekly reports are submitted to the first selectman and whomever else would like them to make sure that they understand the full scope of what's going on. So perhaps one of the issues here is a verbal versus a written update, and I'm only assuming. And I think that's something that I think would fall within the scope of this audit or review. Okay.
Was STV providing any financial reports?
They were providing all the financial reports to the state, yes.
Were they providing any to the town of Fairfield?
Mark Barnhart has them all, yes.
And what was contained in those financial reports? Did it talk about percentages of completion? Did it talk about monthly expenses that were, justified? Did it talk about,
The last one I believe I saw was early April, and I'm guessing it was through March, although I don't know if it was bills through March or work through March, I don't know. But the last one I saw was the one where they started telling me that instead of being under by millions, we were getting close, to being, closer with the budget, and that this dirt started occurring. And that was early first, second week of April. And that was the first inkling I got that we were having some issues with site dirt.
and that's when you thought we were still $300,000 under budget?
Correct.
Was anybody advising you at that point in time that, when you saw that we had reached the end of the amount of contaminated soil, so we should still stay under $300,000
Right,
of budget? Or were you led to believe that they were still finding stuff?
I had a meeting with everybody in my office early that month, and I asked them to give me a projection through the end of the project, an updated projection. I think, and again, I don't know the date. Maybe it was late March. I think it was early April. And at that point, I said I said, guys, do you think this is going to cover whatever's left? I remember Joe Guerrero saying, I can't guarantee that, but I remember him saying, this is my best effort. He did put a lot of the information together. STV, I believe, reviewed it, and that's as far as we got. I was hoping, frankly, they were on the conservative side. I was, maybe I had some rosy-colored glasses, but that's what I was hoping.
Mr. Tetra?
If that was a report, would it be possible to get a copy of that?
I actually was trying to ask your staff a few weeks ago if they could dig it out, because I had left it in a folder for Sherry behind my computer. I had 4 documents in a folder for the incoming first selectman, and the first thing on the list was that report, the munis statements, and my reconciliation of the munis statements showing exactly where we are in the budget. That was in a folder right behind my computer, and I was hoping I could find that file. I know things got moved around.
Were you the only one with a copy of that, or would somebody else in the meeting also have a copy?
I made my own notes in that, and they're somewhere, hopefully, in the office, but I was the only one that made those notes. I don't recall if I gave Mark a copy of my notes or not.
So it was a verbal report.
Mark might have taken a copy, Mike.
Was this were your notes the handwritten update?
Handwritten.
Okay, so-
I made some handwritten notes on the munis pages.
Okay, I
because
thought
was
that,
try-
okay.
I was trying to take from Caitlin what I saw in munis with the budget, comparing it to what Guerrera gave, and trying to make my own.
Were the projections through the end of the project your handwritten notes, or were those computer reports?
The reports with all the cost estimates on construction was a report from Guerrera that was a 11 by 17 kind of 3-page thing, line by line, every bid line. I don't know if they've had any since then that you've seen, but every bid line that they were responsible for. What I tried to do was I took that, I said, okay, here's my estimate of soft costs based on what Mark and I knew were the soft costs. I tried to do my own little addition to see how close to 29, 30 million we were. They were, I believe, between 24 and 25 million at that point in that report on construction. That's from memory.
And soft costs included what? The soft costs were not
STV,
included in the
parts-
computer reports. Those were
Correct.
additional.
Correct.
Okay.
We had not had Mark has a spreadsheet of the soft costs that he's kept, and I don't remember if that was in this pile or not, but I had made my notes saying this is the estimate. Mark has a spreadsheet with every vendor's soft cost, every engineer, every consultant, everybody.
Okay, so those were engineer costs or design costs or something that were not part of the construction
Correct.
part of the
Yeah.
project.
So the construction started at 21. It had gone up to 24, 25. The soft costs were 3, something like that. We had spent $1 million a number of years, from 2003 to 2010. And when you add all that up, that's where I thought we were at.
Okay, so between the computer reports and the handwritten notes, that's how we got the projection for where we...
That's why I did my back of the napkin projection, and you're correct. It was not as perhaps thorough as it should have been, and if not, believe me, I'm wishing now that it may have been.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the point of it's probably something that the construction manager should have been putting together as opposed to the first selectman on a computer printout, right? It's something that, again, I hope that we find out and that we correct that problem going forward. Is there anything else?
Yes, bringing some of this stuff up based on Mr. Tetro's comments, are there any directories in the town computer system that he does not know of that there are reports on or something else like that? Because we're talking about stuff that was in an office, and I just want to make sure that they have everything that they should have and that was ever prepared on this project, and that they're not in some, like, directory called train station that no one knows where it is.
All I can say is, from my end, there's no such thing. You're more than happy to check every darn email in the system and every document in the office. I have left everything that was there, everything. In fact, my staff, you heard me say, I'm not doing what I came into 10 years ago, 12 years ago. So nothing was removed from that office.
Okay.
There were a few copies of things I made. So everything's there in files. There's volumes of files, but it's all there.
I take it Jen
And on the
Jen knows
computers.
where that stuff is stored on the
Don
town's
Don
computer
Leslie
system.
has
and-
my hard drive and the whole thing, and,
Okay.
yep.
Okay. When we took over the project management on this, a lot of this seems to do with numbers that seem to be better be placed in the fiscal officer's department, not particularly by him, but somebody in the department to prepare spreadsheets, worksheets, whatever. Was that ever considered? And what made Mr. Barnhart the best person for this role, I guess?
In my perspective, Paul, I won't belabor it. They were very short-staffed from winter to summer. As you know, they were trying to hire an analyst. Caitlin was really up to her ears in work. She did help a little bit with Mark. They compared, I don't know how many times, but I can tell you they talked a fair amount over the months, comparing, money coming in, bills going out, that kind of stuff. But as far as a forecast, the office, I don't believe, was asked to do that. And frankly, because I thought we were under budget most of the time, I didn't think we needed much more of a forecast, but the last few months proved me wrong, or, it shows that it's wrong.
And were you the only one within the town that was keeping track of where we were going forward? Like, everyone else seems to be paying attention to what money's coming in, what money's going out. But were you the only one forecasting whether we were going to be on budget or not?
Mark, to the best of my knowledge, Mark was trying to do that as well. And, we often compared notes, but there wasn't one specific repository of those reports. We had a lot. He does have a lot of reports, by the way. You'll see he has his weekly things, and I'm sure Mike can give you a lot of stuff. So he may have more than I even saw in the way of these reports.
When the new contract was signed in 2010, in addition to the state coming up and putting $19.4 million up, one of the big things changed was that the town taking the risk on all cost overruns. Were numbers prepared at that point in time to know whether we were going to be on target for the money that the developer was putting in, the money that the state was putting in, the 19.1 basically, because they took $300,000 off the top, and our $6 million, which we had previously bonded,
Right.
that was going to be enough? And what I'm asking, I guess, is, did we do the analysis? Did somebody else do that analysis to make sure that that seemed to be enough?
Yes, there was that negotiation took 3 months, 2 to 3 months. The state required a full analysis by their own Department of Transportation. They took all the documents that BlackRock Realty ever produced on costs. They actually wanted proof that BlackRock Realty had spent $10 to $15 million before 2010. They got all those documents to justify for themselves that they felt that the developer had done certain things. They did a full, and we have, Mark has, it's in my office somewhere, there was a schedule produced of all the forecasts that came up to $29.4 million.
Who checked them on our side?
On our side, Dick and myself, because those negotiations were very top, high level. The governor's office had requested and required us to have a cone of silence. I had briefed the selectmen once or twice in executive session on parts of the negotiations, but they were very, as the senator can tell you, very determined to keep it very close to the vest. So Dick and I had those numbers. I believe I shared them once with Mark, but told him he couldn't show them to anybody. But we relied on the DOT to vet those numbers.
But the chief fiscal officer wasn't even involved?
We were not. We were told we could not share them with anybody. It was a subject of three-party negotiation. And we were told, I actually talked about, could we share them with people on the town staff, and they said no.
Not even the chief fiscal officer?
when you're asking the state for a huge amount of money, they're big brother, big sister, and I felt pretty comfortable that they were vetting this very carefully, frankly.
Yeah, but they're the ones who hedged their risk and asked us to take the entire risk and then determined who you could have in the room to negotiate the deal. And
Except,
said one of the people was not your fiscal officer?
except that we had a whole series of people working with BlackRock that we had access to, Lorero, among some of the others, that put a lot of the environmental numbers together. Parsons Brinkerhoff, BlackRock Realty gave the town access to their consultants at that point. We were able to discuss with them all these things. So I would say, given that only people that worked on that site had direct knowledge of what was on that site, and only BlackRock Realty, who owned that site, had that information. So nobody in the fiscal office could have guessed what was in that site, how much contamination, how many yards of fill, or anything like that. So as much as we would have liked that, the state didn't have access to that, we didn't have access, we had to rely on BlackRock Realty's consultants, and the state had to rely on them as well, and use their professional DOT staff to ask as many questions as they could. And we had to do this in about eight weeks.
So we entered an agreement on a $40 million project. Granted, it wasn't all our money. And we put the chief fiscal officer on the beach.
Again, we were told we could, it was attorney-client privilege. I have, Dick can show you all the attorney-client. You could only share this attorney-client.
But the
And-
town's the client, not
Correct.
the first selectman.
But they were only willing to deal with the first selectman and nobody else. That was told to me ad nauseum a number of times, because I wanted to bring other people up to the meetings. And that was the way it was. But I will tell you
Can
that...
I ask another question, though?
If
Due
I
to
could
the...
just
Oh, yes,
follow
you
up on that,
can.
Mike?
I'm sorry.
Tom.
Yeah, please.
We tried, obviously, because we had the same concern. We didn't want to have any risk, from our point of view, of any significance. And we had a lot of debates about the last $1 million or $2 million and how much was going to be put in by each party. There was a call when I was in the White House on a mayor's meeting, literally in the Blue Room on the phone, missing the president's presentation because I was on the phone on this negotiation. All I can tell you is everybody vetted it as best they could, and all I knew is the work was going to stop if we didn't get this state money fast.
Due to these requirements on the confidentiality and all that, was there ever a time that information was withheld from other town bodies due to not being able to discuss it?
I tried my best a few times to give the selectmen a sense of it, but when the actual documents were being written, this was a first selectman, as the town attorney, and it's in this minutes of our meeting, as the town attorney attested, he felt I had the authority under the initial contract to make those decisions on behalf of the town bodies for this. I did my best. And if we come in $3 million under budget, I'm sure everybody would have been slapping me on the back happy.
No, I just didn't know how much you paint a pretty strong picture of conditions under which you were operating, and the question was just, did that result in you withholding information from other town bodies that would have been beneficial to us, knowing sooner rather than later?
The only thing we had to withhold were the actual negotiations, the amounts being negotiated, until we had a three-party verbal agreement, which hadn't even been reduced to writing. At that point, I actually briefed the selectmen to some extent on the rough parameters of it, and then after the fact, the town boards. But it was a very, dicey period. I guess that's the best way I can describe it.
Thank you.
Well, you never briefed me, because I was a selectman at the time.
Yeah.
So it was just you, I guess are you saying that you told Sherry about that?
Well, there's notes in this minutes talking about, that you can see here, Mike mentioning how I had talked to Ralph and how much he said he wanted to get this done and that he supported our motion to approve these agreements. And that was in his last few weeks, unfortunately. But, and I don't remember, Sherry, if we had one or two. But some of the outline of this was discussed as soon as I could. It wasn't during the meat of it. It was toward the end of it. It wasn't because, frankly, BlackRock Realty, there were a lot of fits and starts during that negotiation, and it almost didn't happen. It only came together in the last 48 hours of that negotiation. I didn't think it was actually going to happen.
In taking on the risk, when we did when you signed the 2010 agreement, did you have environmental reports that had gone around and tested the entire property to try to determine what the amount of contaminated soil there would be?
There were reports that the DEP had, that the DOT had from the DEP from the 80s, when there was a cleanup of that site of all the toxic stuff. That's why it's all casting sands. There was millions of dollars cleaned up in the 80s. That's why there's so little left of anything significant, even though unfortunately they found a few more PCBs than they expected. But all that testing was done. BlackRock Realty had done some samples, and when we had to bail when the developer was in foreclosure, and this was falling apart, we had a month or two to try to figure out how to make it work. So the answer is whatever we had was the information that was available through the developer or through the state DEP, but nothing further. So no, every ounce of the site was not tested.
The other night, when Mr. Tetro made his presentation, Town Attorney Saxel was asked by me whether he had explained the risks of the new revised contract from April 2010 with you. And he said he had. And I also followed up, and I'm like, did he understand the risks he was taking on behalf of the taxpayers of Fairfield? And he said that you did.
And I explained it at every public meeting, Jim. I said, this is the amount the state has. We're responsible. It's in the Board of Finance minutes. I said it at the RTM meeting. There's a question from Ed Bateson about funding. And the selectmen certainly knew that the state was willing to give us this, and that was it. And yes, I mean, that was a no-brainer.
I guess the thought is, though, that if we
Sure
had
you
these
remember that.
weeks
You were on the
weeks to
RTM.
do it, whether we could have brought in an environmental company to maybe test the property to see what we were buying, because we kind of went from a situation where we were locked in at basically $6 million, money that we had appropriated and had bonded years earlier, and then we got to a situation where if, God forbid, the worst estimates come in, we're double that, and if it even gets worse, we've given up a revenue source if your 50-50 analysis doesn't work out.
The way I look at it in the big picture, we can micromanage this as much as possible. We were at a point where the project was going to be dead forever. BlackRock Realty was going to be gone, the state was going to bail out, and we were left holding the bag with a dirty site that would never be touched for another 20 years, in my opinion. BlackRock Realty spent 5 years explaining to the Conservation Commission why they couldn't afford to do this cleanup the way that the conservation staff wanted to do it. We've had these meetings, it's been in the newspapers year in, year out about the risks of this site. Paul Audley reviewed this site in 1993 when he proposed it for a recreation site. So this town has had numerous reviews of this site. It's a question of whether you believe this, in my opinion, and I'll stop, whether you believe this revitalization is worth it for the long term of the town. If it ends up being a few million more, even more than a few million more, if this eventually gets revitalized, and if the forecast that Paul Hiller put together 8 years ago of $6 million a year in 2003 numbers to our town budget every year, once some of these buildings get built, that's $60 million over 10 years. To me, it's well worth a few $1 million of extra cost to get this site revitalized, to get the commuters a happy solution, and have grand list money up the kazoo coming to us permanently year in, year out, and revitalizing the entire area around it that has been jump-started because of this project that we created. So yes, I believe it's a great investment, no matter what it costs, $6 million, $8 million, $10 million. I think I negotiated a heck of a deal and saved this town over $10 million from what we would have spent. If you recall, Jim, you were there. John Mitsopoulos proposed $24 million of town spending, and I don't want to get, excuse me, I promised the chair I would not get political. But as you know, everybody on one side of the aisle was supportive of that, and I negotiated it down to $6 million. So I did my job. Thank you.
Well, just a couple of follow-up comments I guess I have to that. I understand that you think that the deal was dead back in January or whatever, and that nobody was going to come in for another 20 years. I think somebody would have come in. I mean, you know, no one knows what would have happened. But there was people out there trying to buy out Wittick's mortgage to try to foreclose on him back when all this was going on. So somebody, I think, would have stepped up. We don't know what would have happened. In regards to where we are right now, you know, you kind of can't have it both ways. I mean, you went out of your way. I mean, I've read all the reports made to the RTM going all the way back to say that basically, you know, what a great job you had done in negotiating this deal for $6 million and how we were getting $6 million back. And I guess we were all happy with that, but now that deal seems to be changing. Now it seems like we may be on the hook for a worst-case scenario of another $6 million, and we may not be getting that $6 million reimbursement from the state because we might not, and, you know, we'd have to see these pro formas, we might not be getting that $300,000 back a year for 20 years. So that's a complete change of this deal. It just, the numbers are quite large. Those are my
I
comments.
do
I'm gonna go
accept
to-
some of the responsibility for some of these decisions, absolutely. And, you know, I wish some of this wasn't happening either.
Let's go to Mr. Bolito, who's been waiting patiently.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to belabor this, but something you said, Mr. Flato, troubled me a great deal. You said that information was withheld from our chief fiscal officer and the town boards and bodies because
Sorry.
the state basically told you attorney-client privilege prevents you from speaking to the town boards and bodies. Am I stating that accurately?
Let me try to rephrase it. We never had that discussion specifically. They said, look, we need one negotiator, the chief executive officer and his town attorney. That's all we feel comfortable talking with about this transaction. They said this is attorney-client privilege. The negotiations cannot be shared with anybody else. The specific negotiations and what we were talking about in terms of how much and all that part is accurate. I kind of, in effect, was paraphrasing. You know, they didn't specifically tell me not to talk to, you know, Paul Hiller, but I took that under my fiduciary responsibility and said, I believe, you know, we should keep this close to the vest. It's a private negotiation. If I thought there was something I needed from the fiscal officer, you can be assured I would have asked for it, just as I asked for certain information during those negotiations from BlackRock Realty directly, and Dick and I went through stuff and had a meeting with Brian Cutler, you know, about the environmental issues, so we could get our arms around the projection on that. But, you know, Paul didn't have any other information he could give me about the projected costs. So
What concerns me, though, is the fact that Mr. Hiller was effectively excluded from the negotiations, the fact that he would not be able to bring to light the financial ramifications of this new deal on the town. And what also concerns me is the fact that, I'm assuming Attorney Saxel represented the town during these negotiations, is that correct?
yes.
I don't know how, I could be wrong, but I don't know how an attorney would think that attorney-client privilege in this particular case would apply only to the first selectman and not to other town officials who also represent the interests of the town. That just doesn't make sense to me, and it's very bothersome.
I appreciate your comments. Like I say, if we had something that we needed information from Paul, we would have asked him, but it didn't appear to be anything that and we certainly full well knew the risks, and I described those risks publicly at every meeting after we signed the agreement and explained it and said, here's what we've done. So I was clear, it's in your minutes. And,
Oh, I agree with you that the risk was clear. I don't think it was a surprise to anyone when we saw the agreement last year. Certainly, the risk was readily apparent, and I asked you about it at this board's meeting. I don't think we have any surprise about the risk, but what concerns me is the flow of information. The fact that during the negotiations, there seemed to be a certain cloistered group in that room who were negotiating a deal that is now going to cost the town potentially $2 to $6 million. And the fact that there was no flow of information from people who perhaps could have brought something to the table, perhaps could have brought light to certain, you know, facts earlier in the process when we still had an opportunity to negotiate those things into the contract. Now it's too late. The contract is what it is. So, you know, it's very troublesome that attorney-client privilege would be taken to mean that relevant facts to a negotiation should not be shared with bodies that properly should have been informed at the time. That's all I'll say on it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. I'm going to go to Mr. Kiley quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do realize we're getting later and a bit more off track here, but I do have a question. I do know that Mr. Flynn did invite Town Attorney Saxel to be here this evening, as well as Assistant Town Attorney And I don't see them, and there's a couple points during this meeting so far where I think they may have been helpful.
Mr. Kiley, I invited them through Mr. Hiller, so I just want that to be
Okay.
known. So I didn't speak to them directly.
Oh, okay, thank you. And seems like there's a couple points here where they may have been helpful answering a few questions. So I guess my question would be to Mr. Tetro, why are they not here?
Simply, I don't know. I wasn't,
It went through Mr. Hiller.
it went
All
to
right,
Mr.
I'm
Hillis.
sorry,
so-
then, Mr. Hiller.
When this notice was sent out late yesterday afternoon, I copied both Attorney Saxel and Attorney Kennelly. I did not speak to Ms. Kennelly, saw her from a distance earlier today. I spoke to Attorney Saxel, and he just had other commitments.
So this meeting that he was a party to and this contract that he was negotiating on behalf of the town was not an important enough event for him to be here? Seemingly.
Mr. Tetra?
I think that the simple answer is that we can make sure that Attorney Saxel and Assistant Town Attorney Kennelly are here at an appropriate time, so you can get any of your questions answered.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Based on
Mr.
the
Fisher.
agenda, they might not have understood some of the contract points.
They were through Mr. Hiller. Mr. Hiller, I did specifically ask you to bring them, correct? Yeah.
No, then I'm sorry, I just wasn't aware of that.
Mr. Walsh?
Mr. Tetra, I think going forward, as we have some more of these meetings, that they be required to attend all of these meetings. They were an intricate part of this process. They're going to be an intricate part of the process going forward. We're his largest client. He should be here. And I don't care what his other things are, he's going to have to make himself available.
That sounds very reasonable.
Good. I let the discussion go a little off track because I know Mr. Flato had some things he wanted to get off his chest and be able to say publicly, and this has been his first time to publicly comment it. And I thought it appropriate that the others who were part of this discussion have that ability to do that as well. So thank you for the dialogue. In listening to it, I understand the risk, and I think it is fair to say, and you did, Mr. Flato, bring documentation regarding that the risk was known last year, which I would agree to as well. I think what was not clear, at least, I'll speak for myself, I think I can speak for our board, is that there's an anticipation that there's a certain amount of risk mitigation that's done behind the scenes, whether that be by the engagement of a construction manager who's providing financial updates and weekly status reports in a written format, whether it's by the oversight of the chief fiscal officer. But there's a certain degree of care that you would expect, particularly in a project where you've elected to accept this degree of risk. And it seems apparent that those general risk mitigation steps were either A, not taken, or B, were inadequate, so that in the 10th or 11th hour of a project, while it's handed off, you have these surprises and explosions, which cause the consternation and the concern, which, again, I'll go back to the fact, the comments made by former First Selectman Stenick, by First Selectman Tetro, as well as your own comments in the press, lead me to believe that we need a full review of the project from an independent third party to make sure that we know where it went wrong, what could have been done better on the oversight of the project from the administration standpoint, and so that we level set exactly where this project is as of today. I want to commend everybody on the work that was done to put together the package that was put forth last Monday. But as dialogue earlier today suggests, there could still be some holes within that package, as it's unclear as to some of the year-to-date numbers, as I'll call them, whether they were expended and/or expended plus incurred. So I still am of firm belief that we should engage an independent third party, and with that in mind, I asked our auditors to come this evening and to discuss with us a process that we may be able to go through within the next couple of weeks to provide information back to the town bodies as to the status of the project, the status of the controls, their recommendation for improving the controls before we move forward and approve the expenditure of any more funds on this project. With that in mind, I'll open it up for any thoughts that some board members might have.
Thank you, Chairman Flynn. As a public citizen, I support anything you do to review and audit this. I think it's a healthy exercise, and I absolutely support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Flato, again. Okay. Does anybody have any comments? I had laid out some of my own personal thoughts on what I thought was important here in terms of a document and in terms of a process to go through. I'll list them one more time and allow everybody to comment, and we can consider this. Number one, I would like to see a complete flow of funds of where the revenues so far have come from, including the reimbursement process and the controls surrounding the reimbursement process, as well as the level of expenditures to date, the timing of those expenditures, as well as a listing of the vendors that were paid and what they were paid for. So, Jim, that would cover your comments earlier concerning legal fees. It would kind of cover comments regarding professional fees, project insurance, what have you, would all be covered by that complete listing of the vendors and what they were paid. As part of that, my recommendation would be that we review and make sure that, to an earlier comment this evening, the expenditures were made in accordance with the bond resolution, meaning, again, specifically that there was not monies expended in other areas, as you discussed, so that the monies were spent as intended to further this project along. Number three, basically I'd like to reaffirm the numbers that were presented before us as to the current funding status of the project. Now, I think, as opposed to having them from April, it'd be most beneficial to have them from the end of June, if that's possible. Now, that may not be possible. So perhaps we need them through the end of May with some commentary on June, and I leave that to your good judgment as to what the information would be available to finish this report on an expedited basis. The other items I would want would be an internal reporting structure. I'd like to know, through the course of this project, were there weekly reports being put together? Were there weekly financial reports putting together? Who were those reports shared with? Where did those reports go? What other bullet point lists were put together? And what should have been known about this project and when? Not only, it's not so much to look back, although that'll be useful, but it's also to make sure that we have the right control structure moving forward, and so that we're not surprised again by this project or any other. The other items I would recommend that our auditors should recommend to us any controls or reporting improvements that they might have come across. I would also say that, Mr. Tetra, I firmly support the engagement of a construction manager for this, and I would think they could be an integral part of this process of recommending how they would go about controlling it and improving it. Perhaps they could work along very early on with our our external auditors to improve that process. Lastly, I think it is important that, and I don't mean this with any disrespect to the administration, but I would like the reports to be shared directly with a subcommittee of this board and not going through directly through the administration at this time. I would like it shared with the administration. I would like it discussed with the administration. But I would, and I hope the board supports a subcommittee of this board working directly with our external auditors to do this. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I'd like to have Mr. Kiley head that up as our most senior member. And I'd like Mrs. LeClaire, the second most senior member, and Mr. Brockfeld also to serve on that if they would. And then I would like the findings, the report, to be shared and presented to the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, the RTM, as well as the RTM subcommittees, so we can make sure the information flow of these financial controls is very well understood by everybody and all engaged parties in this. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, additions to my report? I'm going to go to Mr. Brockfeld first.
Actually, no, I think it's an extremely exhaustive list, and I appreciate, Tom, the work you must have put in to come up with all those items. I support all of them. I guess the only question I have to you is a timing issue, because I think that we have a number of concurrent missions here, and one of them is to complete the train station, I think. I mean, that's not our job per se, but I think that there's a sense in the community that a 95% completed train station stopped would not be a good idea. So do you have enough time to put this thing together and get it back and report it out and so forth and so on so that we can move forward in a timely fashion?
Before the 4th of July, right?
I was gonna say,
That's right, preferably before Monday.
I need the deadline first to be able to answer that question. I guess what is your deadline, or what is your projected deadline?
Yesterday would be good.
Yesterday.
Actually, I'd like it from last Friday, please.
Well, I guess the answer to that would have to come from Mr. Tetro, who has
Right.
a better sense of what needs to be done and when on the
And-
project.
And Mr. Brockfield, I thank you for the question. I will turn it over to Mr. Tetro. The only addendum I would make to your comment is, this is somewhat linear. I don't know, quite frankly, if A doesn't happen, if B, C, and D are going to happen, is the way I'd said it. So I think this is a critical path item from my perspective.
And all of it's 100% accurate. The only
Yeah.
question I'm thinking is that, again, this is an evolving process, but what I've heard is that we're going to have to appropriate money, or actually bonding,
Right.
in order to keep this thing moving. And so there is an actual timeline. Some of it
No
can't be
question.
concurrent. We can't be going, because this board doesn't want to approve bonding before we have the reports.
Agree
Right.
completely.
Okay.
Mr. Tetra.
Yeah, I think simply it's Mr. Chair, based on your comments, the concerns of this board, the concerns of the RTM for the other night, the information has to be provided first. So I would suggest that as a rough timing at this point, that we look at the month of July for doing that, so we get it back to this board and get it back to the RTM. We've just started to receive some of the input from the RTM in terms of their concerns, their questions. It's going to take a little while to pull that together and then get that back to the RTM on a timely basis. If we go with our normal reporting process, or approval process, rather, then we look at perhaps the first Board of Selectmen meeting in August, the Board of Finance meeting in August, and the RTM meeting in August. Given, as Pogo said, I've met the enemy and he is us, we're the people that control those dates. So if perchance we needed to short-circuit those a bit with the agreement of the appropriate boards to change their schedule, we could buy some more time if that were needed. However, I'd say Plan A might be to shoot for getting this information in late July, so that gives us time to put things together, make sure everybody's comfortable with the information, and if too many questions come up or folks aren't comfortable, we need another round, we deal with that at that point as it comes up.
I think we have Paul, please remind me if you can, we have a July quarterly review meeting.
July 27th.
Okay, so can we, for planning purposes of here, assume a deadline of July 27th? I'm not saying you need to give the report that day in terms of present it that day, but I think that's a good planning day so that Mr. Kiley's subcommittee can tell us where he stands with the report as of that day. Does that sound reasonable?
For a lot of this, and maybe I can go back and kind of look at this, I think some things are more critical than others, say the control
Yes.
part to follow. So if I can prioritize the big pieces that will help you make the decision by
I
a
w-
certain date, that would,
I'd leave that in the hands of the subcommittee.
okay.
Okay.
on the ground doing audit work yet?
Are you on the ground doing your regular audit work yet, is the question?
Yeah, we have been out already. I'm not sure what the next day we're scheduled back, but we've been out a couple times starting the audit work, yes.
Okay, and that's on the town side, not on the train station side. Mr. Walsh, you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, I think you gave a very comprehensive list. I just have some clarifications.
Please.
Number one, I think we're going to have to make sure somebody gets you what the scope of the work was so you know when you're going through these invoices what was hopefully all proper, but maybe there was some
Right.
invoice that should not have been possibly paid that was. And I just want to hope that it covers, you're going to go through every expense that was done.
Is that what,
That's what I would like done.
Yes.
so 2003, for time period, literally day one,
Basically working off of the schedule that Mr. Tetro put together from inception forward.
And I don't know how you do that, whether you look at every check, what it was for, whatever it is, but,
well, making a couple notes as when you want vendor listing and what paid for, again, how detailed do we get? Because the same vendor could do 5 things. How do you want me to classify them? Now we're talking a real lot of time
I
to
think-
classify that.
When I wrote that out, I would just like the vendor and the items that they're being paid for, one listing. I don't need it broken out 5 different times.
Right, well, you mentioned, say, town attorney, it could be 20 different things. Maybe it's contract, maybe it's this, maybe it's this.
I wanna
Do you
know that
wanna
it
know
was-
all that?
I want to know that it was, A, related to the train station, and B, appropriately within the bond resolution. That would be my druthers.
Okay, without diving into detail, just kind of related to the
Unless,
train.
I think as a standard audit, as you well know, I'm talking to the pro here, you go into more detail if you find an exception. If it's not an exception, you don't need to go into as much detail, right?
Right.
So if you find that something's not within the bond resolution, I think the term we use around here is excavate.
Okay.
And just so we're clear, that work is basically work that was done on that property, or with the traffic improvements were done at specific locations, because they're very well detailed where those traffic improvements were going to be done. To me, anything else other than that is something for you to look into
And
further.
To clarify, the intersection is part of this, it's, because they're separate accounting-wise, so, but you want both pieces.
We do, and I would suggest we can, I think a good place to start is the presentation we were given last night, or on Monday night, for setting the scope for that. Mr. Walsh, anything further?
I think you covered this, but I just want to make sure that what's also looked at is, when you look at the reports that you look at or were available, what other reports do you think, as an auditor, should have been prepared to help us, be able to forecast whether we were behind or ahead on this project?
I think that's something you can work in concert with the construction manager.
Right, it would kind of fall into the recommendations
Exactly.
piece as far as what do they have and what would have been the best-case scenario.
And I guess lastly is, who should have had those reports and where should they have been? Because what's really concerning me is that when Sherry discovers the problem and tries to get a handle on it and brings Mike in, and it basically took 7 weeks for him to prepare that PowerPoint presentation, and to try to figure out where we were, and what happened. To me, that seems completely unacceptable, that we would have a project manager on the job, and it take a first selectman or two, what ended up being 2 first selectmen, 7 weeks to basically bring in resources to try to put together a half-an-hour presentation. It seems as though those numbers and things should have been readily available out of files that people had, and maybe do that after a day or two, but 7 weeks seems to be exorbitant time and shows the amount of digging they had to do to get to the bottom of this. So, I guess I'm concerned with where those reports were, where they should have been, whether a first select, we should have access to that stuff,
Yeah,
things
my-
like that.
Yeah, my request does cover that. Yeah,
Okay.
I agree. Yeah, it does. Any other thoughts, comments on this item?
Just a couple.
Please, Mr. Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Centrofani, for being here and for accepting this monumental task on the fly. We do appreciate that. Having been through many personal or business audits, typically the first step is for us to get a diligence list from you on what you're going to need and from whom and what those components are. So if you could start thinking about what that diligence list will consist of, so that we can get it distributed through the first selectman or through the Board of Finance chairman to the appropriate parties, maybe that would help expedite the process that certainly will take a few weeks, it sounds like, at the very least. And the other comment I'd like to make is it sounds like it's going to have to be all hands on deck, because there is going to be a lot of information that this report is going to require, so that you'll have your diligence request items fulfilled and you're able to complete your report and work with our subcommittee. You know, so it sounds like a pretty monumental task, and it just, I don't know what the workload is in your office these days, and I suspect it's relatively high since it's year end. But my question or my point is, you know, there's no way to get this done without all hands on deck. And if it's going to hold up the report, which could in turn hold up the funding process, et cetera, I think we need to think about that long and hard now.
If I could just comment on that, I think, and I have not talked this out with Mr. Tetro or with others, but I would think right now, Mrs. Bossi is well involved, obviously, with year-end matters and stuff like, matters such as that, that Mrs. Gardner and Ms. Nolfi would be primary suspects to be assigned to this task. Working, obviously, alongside Mr. Barnhart's going to have to do a great deal of this work, too. I mean, but I, you know, I think we can, that I can volunteer at this point, those people from my staff to work on that.
Any other questions, comments from board members on this? Mr. Tetro?
Just to help clarify, certainly I agree with Mr. Kiley in terms of the priority and the import of this. Mr. Kiley, we may need your help a little bit. As we get questions from the RTM, if they're going to be covered in the work that you're doing, if we could ask just you to, I guess you and I will talk, and if it's going to be covered in this, just so we're not doing double duty, because we have a commitment to the RTM to get back the information they need. So we're not doing double duty. If it's covered in this report, we may just ask you to confirm with Mr. Steele that it will be covered in your report, so we don't have to do it twice. That's all.
Absolutely. That's a good idea. Thanks.
It might make some sense, Mr. Flynn, for you to issue to the RTM and to everybody that the Board of Finance has asked for this and what the scope of it is, so that everyone knows, and it might cut off some questions until that report comes out.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. The process will have to be followed as this. The thing we haven't discussed yet is funding for this. And we're going to have to make an appropriation from the contingency fund. Obviously, the exact, Mr. Tetro, did you have a thought?
I just was going to ask you to be clear on which year.
You know, if we have anything left over this year, we might want to use it in 2010.
Yeah, based on a cursory review, I'm not sure there's anything left over in next year's contingency.
There you go. Okay. So let's use it from, hey, good job, 17 days in, and you've spent out the contingency for 2011. Way to go. Or 2012.
The year hasn't started.
You're off to a rousing start there, pal. Okay, so.
To get ahead of the curve, Mr. Chair.
So we're going to go to 2011, I guess, fiscal year 2011. It closes this week. So good thing we slipped this in under the wire. We're going to have to do an appropriation from that year, and it will have to go to the RTM to be approved. So what I've done is I've already alerted Mr. Steele to that, and that was under advice of Mr. Hiller.
Yeah, Mr. Hiller, is that, how does the accounting work on that, given the timing? Can we do that?
I'll turn to Mr. Centofanti. Obviously, it's going before here. I think, we have not closed the books, nor has the Board of Education. And we won't close the books well into August, at least, for that. And so I think, unless, do you have any problems with that, Joe? Because it wouldn't be approved, obviously. I think Mr. Steele intends to hold special meetings with the RTM next week.
He does.
On this matter. At least in fact, I know that the town clerk reserved this room for Tuesday and Thursday night of next week. I see Mrs. McCarthy-Vahey nodding yes on that. And so I think to fast-track this, that would be, so we would have an appropriation by July 7th, as far as this is concerned. We are required to get legislative approval to take money out of the contingency fund.
Right.
Clearly, there is money left in there. The RTM approved the other night the $39,000, which leaves some roughly $454,000 in the contingency fund.
Thank you, Mr. Hiller. Mr. Centofanti, do you have anything to say on that?
No, it would meet the definition of an encumbrance if there is a line that has an appropriation, and you can change that later, subject to your meeting. So I think that is in accordance with all the accounting rules. The PO is issued tomorrow, or
Right. Now, to be fair to Mr. Centrofani, we haven't had the opportunity to speak at length over the fees associated with the, and obviously, Mr. Kiley and his subcommittee are going to have to set forth the deliverable schedule and the work to be complete. So this really needs to be scoped out. So the unfortunate part of this exercise is that we don't have an exact number on the fees right now. So if we were to approve an appropriation, it would have to be up to and not more, or no more than a certain amount. But given the gravity of what we're confronting here, I think that's the appropriate way to go about that. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Again, just a process point, can the Board of Finance initiate that?
We have in the past. We did it for the study we did on the benefits study 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay.
There is some precedent on that.
Yeah, just as long as that's an okay place to start, then I'm okay. I just want to make sure
Yeah.
that the process is appropriate.
I mean, there is some precedent for us having done it before.
Are you proposing that you might do that this evening?
Yes.
Okay, then I would say from our board, I'd like to talk about maybe scheduling a special hearing, like, or soon, Friday.
For?
Hopefully approve.
Well, you don't need to approve it if we do. It goes right
Oh, we don't
the
need to
RTM.
approve it if you start it? Oh, okay, I thought it would still have to come
The
back.
concern would, because we're not here as a Board of Selectmen, we're here as a Board of Finance ex officios, we can't set an agenda and vote on anything tonight. If they vote on it, as long as it starts there, then it just moves on to the RTM, then we're okay.
And that is correct. Mr. Hiller, correct?
That's correct. The action of the Board of Selectmen would be more just a recommendation, and the real test obviously comes with the legislative body as far as this, because in fact, the Board of Finance is a recommendation of the Board of Finance to appropriate the funds.
Great. With that, Mr. Centrofani, we're not going to haggle in public here. I'll leave that to Mr. Kiley and Mr. Hiller. But we had talked about a number, if you want to speak publicly here.
Yeah, I just have a couple quick questions.
Please.
Like one of your, and again, just more just going towards scope, which I know we have to refine, but more from a big picture, one of the questions you said, what went wrong? And that's pretty
What I meant by
broad as
that,
far as-
thank you. Yeah, it's a pretty broad, it could be pretty broad. The control weaknesses that you find.
The controls, okay.
Yes, it's what went wrong with the reporting and the controls.
Okay.
And where the weakness was that A, took 7 weeks to properly understand it, and B, why did this come up in the 10th or 11th hour? And how can we go about improving that going forward? Okay? Is that better?
Yes, yes. All right. And just to clarify, meetings, would it be one meeting with each of those boards, just conceptually, or whatever's needed, I'm sure?
Whatever's
but
needed.
I just,
Whatever's needed.
okay. All right, I guess my gut's saying, based upon some of this and some of those things that were brought up all along the way, I'm not sure how much of it is going to be in the scope, even when we talked in
Yep.
general. So I'd say we're looking for that range between 15 to 20, I think, is
Okay,
the range.
fair enough. I'm sorry? Okay. Any questions, comments, concerns on that? I think this needs to be scoped out, so Mr. Kiley and Mr. Hiller, I'll leave that in your capable hands to handle that.
And secondly,
Please.
normally I don't know if we want to have a meeting to set the scope, or I do an engagement letter saying, this is what I'm going to do, kind of more specifically, and then you would say, yes, that makes sense, that's what I want you to do.
I think that makes sense.
That's fair.
Okay.
It's fair by me. Any questions, comments, concerns from board members? Mr. Bolito?
Just from a procedural standpoint, should we not approve the subcommittee so that there's a entity for the report to go to?
I'll wrap that up with my motion to approve the
Okay,
hiring.
great, thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Okay, seeing no comments, questions from board members on this item, I will open it up to the public for any questions, comments, concerns related to either information flow for this process or the hiring of an external third party to review the process. Is there anybody that would like to comment? Please come forward. And yourself as well, sir.
For the record, my name is Roger O'Torre, 1310 Melville Avenue. This is a question that was asked earlier in the meeting, and I didn't hear the answer fully, so I apologize if it was said. They were talking about the escrow funds, and the first selectman mentioned the conservation bonds that were in escrow. There's also supposed to be, according to the closing letter and the town state agreement, a 4.4 escrow deposit made by the developer, and that is under the control of the escrow agent, who is Mr. Saxel.
Yeah, that's already been expended. They did
Okay,
speak of
that's
that.
gone.
Yes,
Okay, all right, that's fine. Thanks.
sure. Yes, the gentleman had his hand up first, so if I can, and then please, feel free. Please come up, identify yourself and your, yes. Yeah. Sorry about that.
George Basaka, 472 Old Mill Road, Fairfield. I believe for...
Please speak into the microphone, sir, so they can get you on tape.
Yeah. I believe for the benefit of the auditor, it would be important to separate the audit as to the state-town project versus the town developer project. I think if you do that, you will be able to see where the cost overruns occurred, which I think is very important, because then we're left with the question of how important it is to complete the town developer project. You may be able to save money on the town developer project. The state town project provided that the state would contribute $19.4 million and the town would contribute $5 million. I find it interesting that the town developer agreement only mentions the $4,400,000 that the developer would contribute. There is no contribution by the town under that agreement. There's nothing in the closing letter that says the town will contribute any money to the performance of the work to be done under that agreement. And that agreement has to do with capping the contaminated soil and so forth. So how would we attribute a liability to the town to cap the soil or remove the soil when the town hadn't undertaken that obligation?
Thank you.
I'm going to prepare, for the benefit of the board, I'm going to prepare, first of all, let me say, I think you all know that I've been intimately involved with this project over a course of 4 years, with the lawsuit that we brought and so forth. And in doing that, of course, you get very familiar with the agreements and the obligations of the parties. So as a citizen of Fairfield, for the past 69 years, not as an attorney with an agenda, I intend to give you a letter with the best knowledge I have of what went wrong and where we should look for the liability for the cost overruns. And I hope I can get that done in time for you for it to be useful.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for your comments. Please, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Monique Cassidy from 8 Memory Lane in Fairfield. There are two different definitions between a construction manager and a project manager. I think what you're looking for is a project manager. They can keep track of finances, schedules, and all of the things that go wrong on projects and right on projects. That's one. Number two, something you should please discuss privately in your meeting in reference to the performance bonus. Will it be awarded at substantial completion or post-punch list? And who's doing the punch list and who determines when it's complete? And number three, a project manager has really neat software that should be able to give you a presentation very quickly. I think Expedition is one of them. So you should look into that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm sure the First Selectman does as well. Any other questions, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kristen McCarthy Vahey, I'm from the RTM, Melville Avenue. I just want to thank you for participating in this process this way, and I think that there were many RTM members who are here, and I know that the majority leader happens to be away this week, but I'm sure would share the sentiment that we on the RTM want to work with you in terms of anything that we can do to streamline the process and be helpful. We're interested in finding out answers and appreciate your efforts, so thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your time and attention and efforts as well. Please, let's...
James Passery, 691 Fairfield Beach Road. I apologize if these questions have already been answered. Of the parties involved with the project, is it true that the town of Fairfield is solely responsible to any unforeseen expenses in terms of regarding the soil removal?
I'm going to, I limit these to public comments, not questions. You can definitely ask your questions, and then you can ask them privately. If you want to go on the record, ask your questions, and then I'll direct you to the First Selectman's office directly for answers.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thank you for coming and your attendance this evening.
Pamela Iacono, 68 Fife Road, and I just wanted to thank you all for holding this meeting and taking charge of the situation. As a taxpayer, I greatly appreciate it. As a member of the school board, I am greatly disturbed to learn that we might have to be putting off capital projects because of potential cost overruns here. The school board did a lot of homework and putting together our list, and I hate to see things get bumped up. So I hope through your efforts to find out what really is going on here. It turns out to be not as bad as it seems to be. So thank you for doing all of this.
Thank you for the kind comments, and I think we all share your wishes. Anybody else? Any other members of the public? Okay, seeing none, thank you for your time and attention. I'm going to move it back to the board, and I'm going to make a motion that we establish an independent audit to be conducted by the town's outside auditors and to be reported on to a subcommittee of the Board of Finance, comprised of Mr. Kevin Kiley to serve as chair, Mrs. Mary LeClaire, and Mr. Ken Brockville, with a time period to finalize the report by the end of July. And I'm going to ask that we appropriate $20,000, not to exceed $20,000, from the town's contingency fund for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2011. Do I have a second to that motion? Seconded by Mr. Bolito. Questions, comments, concerns by board members? Mr. Brockville.
Yeah, very technical question, only based on my experience in other committees. Sure. Is it appropriate for you as part of the motion to be appointing or recommending the chair of the subcommittee?
That's a very fair question. Mr. Heller.
I'm not a Robert's Rules expert. I think it's, in a sense, two separate motions that you're looking for.
Well, I want to make it one, but I can remove the amount of Kevin being chair.
Because I think there's an
Ken's not gonna vote for it.
appropriation which has to move to the RTM, and I think that the RTM action would not really revolve around the subcommittee. But
Okay,
it's,
so let me do this. I make a motion that we appoint, let me redraw my motion. Okay. I'm going to make two separate motions. Number one, I'm going to make a motion to appoint the town's independent auditors to conduct an independent audit and review of the Metro Center project from inception to current. I'm going to ask that we appropriate $20,000 from the town's, up to, and not to exceed $20,000 from the town's contingency fund in the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2011. And I want to make that motion. May I have a second? Okay? Any questions, comments, concerns about that motion?
I just,
Yes?
quick one for a point of clarification, I think. Is it a full audit that we're discussing, or are we discussing agreed-upon procedures? And this, Joe might need to...
Joe, how do you want to describe it?
Is that...
Yeah, I think what you're talking is more audit procedures, agreed-upon procedures than a technical
Fair enough,
audit.
then we'll call it agreed-upon audit procedures. Thank you. I amend my motion to that. Do you have a
Counter
second?
thing, I don't know.
Second, okay, as amended. Any?
Go over that. Really? Yeah.
Wow, you guys are giving me a workout here. I was on a roll. All right. The motion,
Establish an independent
yeah,
audit?
agreed upon audit procedures.
Thank you.
Okay? Questions, comments, concerns on this motion? Seeing none, we'll go to the public. Any questions, comments, concerns on the public? Yes.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair, Kristen McCarthy-Vahey. And not to be difficult, but just to clarify, there's a lot of work that has to get done here in a very short amount of time. And
Yep.
technically speaking, the work can't really begin on Mr. Centofanti's part until the RTM has approved this
Yep.
appropriation. So just for your consideration in terms of how your board and the subcommittee works in the First Selectman's office to try and streamline things, just clarifying. Just
I don't understand what
commenting
the-
that, I guess it's a question/comment, that the work, his
The work-
side of the work
The work
can't-
is going to be, thank you. The goal here is for the work of the audit committee to be, or the audit firm, to be reviewed and managed by the subcommittee for the next several weeks. And then the audit report will be shared with the entire board, as well as the boards of selectmen and the RTM, and the RTM subcommittees.
And my comment is just, I know that whatever you guys can do, you will do to help streamline this.
Yes,
and
we will.
As fast as possible.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? Yes?
What I thought I heard was that it's important for the chair here to make sure that this item is on the RTM agenda for Tuesday, so it's approved, so that the firm could start on Wednesday morning.
Yep, absolutely. And I've already had discussions with the moderator, so that's that. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed, abstentions? Okay, that appropriation. Second motion I'd like to make is to set up a subcommittee of the Board of Finance to manage the agreed-upon procedures audit of the Metro Center project from inception to date. I would like to appoint to that subcommittee Mr. Kiley, Mr. Brockfeld, and Mrs. Leclerc. Any questions, comments, concerns with establishing a subcommittee? Okay. Any questions, comments from the public? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? And outside the motion, I'd like to make a personal comment that I'd like Mr. Kiley to chair that subcommittee, but that's just me. Any other questions, comments, or concerns to come before the board? Seeing none, does the Board of Selectmen have anything?
This is just my personal comment. When somebody replaces Mr. Tetro on your board, maybe you could have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans on there.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right. I'd like to thank everybody for their time and attention tonight and for putting aside their busy schedules to attend this meeting. May I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Polito, do I have a second? Mr. Brockfeld? All in favor? Opposed? Abstention? Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.